Reality. Denial. Steven Pinker's Apologetics for Western Imperial Violence. Edward S. Herman and David Peterson. It is amusing to see how eagerly the establishment media have welcomed Steven Pinker's 2011 tome, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, one which explains not only that violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, but that we may be living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. To a professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University since 2002 and a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist in the general nonfiction category, 3. Pinker's lovable theme coincides with the Nobel Peace Laureate's current engagement in wars on at least 4 separate continents, his regretful partial withdrawal from invaded and occupied Iraq, his victorious termination of the 2011 war in Libya, his build-up and threats to engage in even larger wars with Syria and Iran, both already underway with aggressive sanctions and an array of covert actions. 4. His semi-secret and ever-widening use of remote-controlled aerial gunships and death squads in global killing operations. 5. And his declaration 8. of the right to kill any person anywhere for national security reasons, officially making the entire world a U.S. free fire zone. 6. The Barack Obama regime, and before it the Bush-Cheney regime, have also supported and protected Israel's escalated ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and the hostile U.S. actions and threats involving Iran and Syria are closely geared with those of Israel. Whereas in Pinker's view there has been a long peace since the end of the Second World War. 7. In the real world there has been a series of long and devastating U.S. wars, in the Koreas, Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with the heavy direct involvement of U.S. clients from Rwanda and Uganda in large-scale Congo killings, and Israel's outbursts in Lebanon, to name a few. There were also very deadly wars in Iran, invaded by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, with Western encouragement and support. And with the stimulus excuse of 9/11, the U.S. political and defense establishment was able to declare a global war on terror, open-ended and still ongoing, to assure that the long peace would not be interrupted by a conflict that met the Pinkerian standards for a real war. In the same time frame as Pinker's new peace, alleged to have begun with the dissolution of the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and of the Soviet Union itself, we have also witnessed the relentless expansion of the U.S.-led NATO bloc, its 1990s war on and dismantlement of Yugoslavia, 8. Its acceptance of new out-of-area responsibilities for security, 9. Its steadily enlarging membership from 16 to 28 states, including the Baltic and former Eastern European satellites of 9. the Soviet Union, and a growing US and NATO encirclement of and threats to China and Russia. 10. And during the first decade of the 21st century, the United States openly embarked on the systematic use of enhanced interrogations and the frequent resort to extraordinary renditions that send captives to torture-prone clients for some not-so-angelic working over. 11. Pinker's standard for an interruption of the long peace would be a war between the great powers. And it is true that the major Axis and Allied powers that fought each other during World War II have not made war among themselves since 1945. But Pinker carries this line of thought even further. He contends not only that the democracies avoid disputes with each other, but that they tend to stay out of disputes across the board, an idea he refers to as the democratic peace. 12. This will surely come as a surprise to the many victims of U.S. assassinations, sanctions, subversions, bombings and invasions since 1945. 13. For Pinker, no attack on a lesser power by one or more of the great democracies counts as a real war or confutes the democratic peace, no matter how many people die. Among respectable countries, Pinker writes, conquest is no longer a thinkable option. A politician in a democracy today who suggested conquering another country would be met not with counterarguments but with puzzlement, embarrassment, or laughter. This is an extremely silly assertion. Presumably, when George Bush and Tony Blair sent US and British forces to attack Iraq in 2003, ousted its government, and replaced it with one operating under laws drafted by the Coalition Provisional Authority, this did not count as conquest, as these leaders never stated that they launched the war to conquer Iraq, but rather to disarm Iraq, to free 10. its people and to defend the world from grave danger. 14. What conqueror has ever pronounced as his goal something other than self-defense and the protection of life and limb? It is on the basis of devices such as this that Pinker's long peace, new peace, and democratic peace rest. And it is in this kind of context Pinker throws in his gentle commerce theme by advancing the so-called Golden Arches peace idea that no two countries with a McDonald's have ever fought in a war. The only unambiguous exception that he can name occurred in 1999, when NATO briefly bombed Yugoslavia. In an endnote he mentions that an earlier marginal exception was the US attack on Panama in 1989, but he dismisses this US war as too insignificant to make the grade. Its death count falls short of the minimum required for a war according to the standard definition, 15. Though according to the UN Charter and customary international law, there was nothing substandard about this unambiguous US aggression against a sovereign country. Here, as in many other places, Pinker selects the estimated death toll that minimizes the U.S. inflicted casualties and fits his political agenda. 16. Pinker mentions in passing that the post-World War II peace among the giants was possibly a result of the immense cost of wars that might involve a nuclear exchange, and it did extend to the Soviet Union during its post-World War II life, but his explanation focuses mainly on the cultural evolution and biological adaptations of the civilized, 17, in contrast with the uncivilized of the Third World. Why this new peaceableness of the civilized does not stop their violent interventions abroad he fails to explain. The exclusion of wars against the uncivilized from his definition of a long peace reflects gross political bias. 11. Pinker attributes the sense of increased violence to multiple illusions, one of which he believes is caused by the development of media and other advanced forms of communication that allow rushing to the spot of bloody events, and recording them and transmitting them to the world. As he explained in a guest appearance on CBS TV's The Early Show in mid-December 2011, not only can we send a helicopter with a film crew to any troubled spot in the world, but now anyone with a cell phone is an instant reporter. They can broadcast color footage of bloodshed wherever it occurs, and so we're very aware of it. 18. Apparently Pinker believes that the media cover the world on a non-discriminatory basis, reporting on Guatemalan peasants slaughtered by their army, civilian victims of U.S. drone warfare in Afghanistan, Honduran protesters shot dead by their own military, and dead and injured U.S. soldiers as aggressively as they report on civilian protesters shot dead on the streets of Tehran, or the victims of the Syrian government or of the late Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. 19. The naivete here is staggering. Pinker's long peace and new peace and their alleged declines of violence not only coincide with the numerous and ongoing attacks by the giants on the midgets, the huge expansion in arms, and the new burgeoning of torture, 20, but runs parallel with the increasing structural violence of a global class war that has resulted in growing inequality within and between countries, systematic dispossession of vast numbers, a widespread seizure of the commons, major migrations, growing cities of slums, increased ethnic tensions and anti-Islamic fervor, deliberately stoked in a troubled, receptive environment, mass incarceration of minority populations, and more vocal oppositional forces both here and abroad. 21. These do not constitute violence in Pinker's accounting system. 12. Pinker's Cold War. Although Pinker covers a great deal of ground from the earliest humans to the present, with numerous figures and learned citations, Better Angels is an overwhelmingly ideological work, with biases that reveal themselves at every level: sourcing, language, framing, historical and political context and substance, and on all topics. Consider this example. You would think that the disappearance of the gravest threat in the history of humanity would bring a sigh of relief among commentators on world affairs. Contrary to expert predictions, there was no invasion of Western Europe by Soviet tanks, no escalation of a crisis in Cuba or Berlin or the Middle East to a nuclear holocaust. The cities of the world were not vaporized, the atmosphere was not poisoned by radioactive fallout or choked with debris that blacked out the sun and sent Homo sapiens the way of the dinosaurs. Not only that, but a reunited Germany did not turn into the Fourth Reich, democracy did not go the way of monarchy, and the great powers and developed nations did not fall into a third world war but rather a long peace, which keeps getting longer. This is of course rhetoric, but it is saturated with political bias, straw persons, and literal errors. The nuclear war threat has not disappeared, and 2 cities of the world were vaporized, with 250,000 civilians killed in 2 quick strokes, but this was done by Pinker's home country, just as nuclear war remains on the table and nuclear arms. 13. Continue to be an integral part of the arsenal of the United States, NATO, Israel, and India, and all despite the United States and the other 4 original nuclear weapons states' promise in 1968 to work toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. 23. Pinker is also misinformed that expert predictions were that Soviet tanks would occupy Europe. He confuses expert opinion and Cold War propaganda. The Soviet Union had been devastated during World War II, and sought loans from the United States in the post-war negotiations. It was a conservative and cautious international actor, and had no nuclear weapon till 1949. John Foster Dulles himself noted that I do not know of any responsible high official, military or civilian, who believes that the Soviet now plans conquest by open military aggression. 24. Writing in 1946 to 1947, U.S. Secretary of State James F. Burns clearly did not expect any Soviet military attacks on Western Europe. 25. He, Dulles, and other officials were mainly worried about Soviet political influence over Western publics, local leaders, and infiltration and subversion, which they countered with money, arms, agreements with local leaders, and their own infiltrators and subversion. Few if any real experts expected the resulting Federal Republic of Germany to turn into a Fourth Reich, but some may have been surprised when the United States and West Germany violated early promises to Mikhail Gorbachev and his Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze in early 1990 not to extend NATO further to the east, in exchange for Moscow's acquiescence to the reunification of East and West Germany later in 1990. 26. Pinker fails to discuss this peace-threatening development, or even mention the existence of the 14. Early promise to Moscow. Indeed, he comments that German reunification and NATO expansion had no discernible effect on the long peace among developed countries, and it presaged a new peace among developing ones. In another blatant display of internalized Cold War ideology, Pinker writes that a romantic, militarized communism inspired the expansionist programs of the Soviet Union and China, who wanted to give a helping hand to the dialectical process by which the proletariat or peasantry would vanquish the bourgeoisie and establish a dictatorship in country after country. The Cold War was the product of the determination of the United States to contain this movement at something close to its boundaries at the end of World War II. So, just as no U.S. politician would suggest conquering another country, the U.S. foreign policy regime has been strictly defensive, containing the expansionist enemy. This is an Orwellian inversion of real history, as neither the Soviet Union nor China displayed any expansionist program after World War II. The Soviet Union never expanded beyond its post-war boundaries and the settlement at Yalta. They did give some modest, mainly rhetorical support to leftist and anti-US forces at a distance, but the United States not only planned a post-war imperial expansion during World War II in its grand area strategies, 27 it actually did expand across the globe, as it fought to contain indigenous nationalist, independence, and social democratic movements, supporting counter-revolution and numerous right-wing and authoritarian regimes on every continent. 28 There are important publicly available documents describing U.S. plans and programs to destabilize, subvert, and replace the Soviet Union. 29 And to intervene to shape and reshape the Third World in a manner that Pinker would surely call subversion and democracy. 15. Busting if attributable to communist powers. 30 But Pinker does not mention them. And for Pinker, the United States never pursued a romantic or self-serving agenda during the long peace, and it gave no helping hand to those who, like Mobutu in Zaire, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Suharto in Indonesia, and Augusto Pinochet in Chile, would support a free market and investor rights. The United States only responded to communist plans and threats. But the Soviets made no distant moves comparable to the US overthrow of Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah dictatorship in Iran in 1953, 31 its Korean and Indo-Chinese wars, its close support of the Indonesian military coup and massacres in 1965 to 1966, its support of the South African apartheid regimes in Angola, Namibia, and Mozambique, as well as South Africa itself, and its heavy involvement in the establishment of military and terror regimes in Brazil, Chile, and throughout Latin America in the post-World War II era. 32 In the case of the central U.S. role in the violent overthrow of a democratic government of Guatemala in 1954, there was a loud official and media claim of a Soviet threat there, but this was a false propaganda cover for the desire to control and establish a completely subservient client in place of one that contested the United Fruit Company's huge influence over policy. 33 But in the U.S. establishment ideology of the Cold War, which Pinker has internalized and repeats throughout his Better Angels, the United States was simply defending the free world against communist expansionism. 16. Disappearing imperialism, the military-industrial complex, and institutional imperative es. Pinker's remarkable inversion of reality in portraying the post-World War II period as a long peace, with residual violence stemming from communist ideology and actions, points up the relevance of Chalmers-Johnson's comment that when imperialist activities produce unmentionable outcomes, then ideological thinking kicks in. 34 It kicks in for Pinker with communist expansionism and U.S. containment. It also kicks in with his notion that communism, but not capitalism, was both utopian and essentialist, submerge individuals into moralized categories, and causing some of the worst atrocities of the modern period. But weren't the racism and anti-communism of the Western powers and in particular the United States essentialist ideologies in the Pinkerian sense, and wedded to the full destructive might of these powers? And didn't these ideologies justify exterminations and massive ethnic cleansings of inferior and threatening peoples, replacing them with advanced peoples and cultures who put resources to a higher use? Weren't Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman, and many other members of the Chicago School of Economics free market ideologues? The U.S. push for markets and investor rights and political control, sometimes called imperialism, is for Pinker just natural and doing good, taking advantage of positive sum business games with gentle commerce, as well as containing those with ideology who kill people freely. The very idea of a capitalist peace is a shock to those who remember when capitalists were considered merchants of death and masters of war. To give one example of Pinker's perspective, 35 Pinker doesn't mention any such thing as aggressive. 17. Commerce or discuss the possibility of the cross-border seizure of property by the more powerful states. There are 17 citations to gentle commerce in his index, and writers who promulgate the related ideas of gentle commerce, democratic peace, liberal peace, capitalist peace, and Kantian peace are featured and referenced lavishly. But there are 0 indexed citations to the word imperialism in Better Angels, and no mentions of Jagdish Bhagwati and Hugh Patrick's aggressive unilateralism, John Hobson's imperialism, John Ellis' The Social History of the Machine Gun, Mike Davis' Late Victorian Holocausts, Penny Lernua's Cry of the People, Gabriel Kalko's Confronting the Third World, Noam Chomsky's Deterring Democracy, Robert Engler's The Politics of Oil, or David Harvey's The New Imperialism. Pinker's ideological thinking stresses the development of positive and humane attitudes by individuals in the civilized states, moving them towards humane policy, opposition to slavery, concern for civilians in war, and moves toward democracy, while he essentially ignores the development of institutional forces that might overwhelm these individual factors and make for serious violence. In addition to his neglect of aggressive commerce and cross-border seizures of people, property, and resources, Pinker ignores the post-World War II growth of U.S. militarism, with its vested interests in weapons and warfare, and the expanding and self-reinforcing power of the iron triangle of the military-industrial complex to shape national policy. This may be why he never mentions, let alone discusses, the classics on this topic by Seymour Melman, Gordon Adams, Richard Kaufman, and Tom Gervasi, 36, or the more recent work of Chalmers Johnson, Andrew Bishvik, Henry Giroux, Nick. 18. Terse, and Winslow Wheeler. 37. These very knowledgeable individuals believe that Eisenhower's warning in his 1960 farewell address about the threat of the military-industrial complex was on target, that the United States is dominated by an institutional structure with a huge vested interest in war rather than peace, and one that has succeeded in making this country into a war-demanding and war-making system. These and other analysts have also featured the encroachment of the permanent war system on civil liberties and democracy, 38, suggesting that any neo-Fukuyama perspective on end-of-histoire liberalism and Pinker's streaky but steady decline in violence is Panglossian nonsense grounded in ideological thinking. Pinker prefers James Sheehan to Chalmers Johnson and Andrew Bishvik. Sheehan's theme in Where Have All the Soldiers Gone?, The Transformation of Modern Europe 39, is that Europeans have changed their very conception of the state, and made the state no longer the proprietor of military force but rather a provisioner of social security and material well-being. But the soldiers are still there, NATO is still expanding, modern Europe is contributing troops and bombs to the Afghan war, was heavily involved in the 2011 war in Libya, and along with the United States, currently threatens Syria and Iran. Europe's social security systems have been under attack for years, and the well-being of ordinary citizens seems to be a declining objective of Europe's leaders, as well as those in the United States. Following the US lead, Europe is moving from cradle-to-grave nurturance back to military prowess, exactly the opposite direction from that Pinker believes they have taken. 19. Vietnam and the anti-war protests. Pinker's proof of a march toward peace has other amusing features. He says that another historic upheaval in the landscape of 20th century values was a resistance by the populations of the democratic nations to their leaders' plans for war, and he spends a fair amount of space describing the growth of peace movement activism in the 1960s and in advance of the war on Iraq. Yet, elsewhere in his book he blames the 1960s movements for their decivilizing impact, but in the present context they allow him to claim their actions as evidence of the march toward the long peace. Pinker claims that in the 1960s the peace movement helped elect Nixon, who shifted the country's war plans from a military victory to a face-saving withdrawal. Elsewhere in his book Pinker writes that the war was ferociously prosecuted by Nixon and that plus 20,000 Americans and 1 million more Vietnamese would seem like big-time war-making. But the peace movement's alleged help in getting Nixon elected is Pinker's evidence for the advance of the better angels. Pinker fails to explain why before, during, and after the Vietnam War the elites have been so little influenced by the masses marching in the streets. Why must the masses even march in the streets? Why must the elites continue to engage in military buildups and serious violence, at heavy economic cost, when according to his preferred expert James Sheehan the state is abandoning military force and focusing on the material well-being of the public? If institutional forces are not the explanation, why don't the better angels trickle up to the leadership, especially when in his view the higher 20. Morality trickles down from the elite to the general population? According to Pinker, the three deadliest post-war conflicts were fueled by Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese communist regimes that had a fanatical dedication to outlasting their opponents. As regards Vietnam, he goes on to show that the Vietnamese were willing to absorb large casualties inflicted on them by the US invaders. For Pinker, this is the fanaticism that fueled the Vietnam War. There is not a word of criticism of the invaders who were willing to inflict those deaths in a distant land, certainly nothing fanatical, no mention of the UN Charter, no word like aggression is applied to this attack, and there is no mention anywhere in the book that the United States had supported the French effort at recolonization, then supported a dictatorship of its own choosing, and that US officials recognized that those fanatical resistors had majority support as we killed vast numbers of them to keep in power our imposed minority government. While acknowledging 800,000 or more civilian battle deaths in the Vietnam War, Pinker does not stop to explain how vast numbers of civilians could be killed in battle and whether these deaths might possibly represent a gross violation of the laws of war, or how this could happen in an era of rising morality and humanistic feelings, and carried out so ruthlessly by the dominant civilized power. Nowhere does Pinker mention the massive U.S. chemical warfare in Vietnam, and the estimated 3 million Vietnamese, including 500,000 children, suffering from the effects of toxic chemicals used during this ugly and very unangelic form of warfare. 40. What makes this suppression especially interesting is that Pinker cites the outlawing and non-use of chemical and biological weapons as evidence of the new evolving higher morality and decline of violence, so his dodging of the facts on the massive use of such weapons in Operation Ranch Hand and other U.S. programs in Vietnam is remarkable dishonesty. Pinker would never think of accepting Vietnamese communist estimates of casualties, just as he does not hesitate to use numbers provided by the U.S. State Department. 41. But nowhere are Pinker's biases more blatantly obvious than in this allocation of Vietnamese civilian battle deaths to the fanaticism of the communist resistance in not surrendering to an invader unleashing incredible violence from abroad for reasons its own leaders had difficulty settling on. Iraq and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Pinker's bias is also extremely clear when he gets to explaining the new morality applied by his country in assaulting Iraq. According to Pinker, the Vietnam Syndrome has caused the U.S. leadership to shy away from wars that will cause many U.S. casualties or impose massive civilian casualties on foreigners. He writes that military leaders at all levels have become aware that gratuitous killing is a public relations disaster at home and counterproductive abroad, alienating allies and emboldening enemies. The Marine Corps has therefore instituted a martial arts program in which leathernecks are indoctrinated in a new mode of honor, the ethical Marine warrior, whose catechism is that the warrior is a protector of life, including not just self and others but all others. After he recounts a long story with a humanistic touch applied to the behavior of U.S. soldiers, Pinker says that the code of the ethnical warrior, even as an aspiration, shows that the American armed forces have come a long way from a time when its soldiers referred to Vietnamese peasants as gooks, slops, and slants, and when 22. The military was slow to investigate atrocities against civilians such as the massacre at My Lai. Pinker provides no evidence that U.S. warriors today don't refer to Iraqis and other invaded peoples with derogatory terms, or that the Marine Warrior Code is even a genuine aspiration as opposed to a PR effort, or that it is actually indoctrinated, let alone taken seriously. He ignores the fact that back at the time of the Vietnam War there was a written military code as well as international law on the treatment of civilians that had no apparent impact on actual policy. 43. He also offers no evidence that the military is more ready now than in the past to investigate atrocities, or that they don't see the main route to dealing with gratuitous civilian killings as non-investigation, denial, and cover-up. Pinker does not mention the repeated official assertion by Gen. Tommy Franks, the original commander of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, that we don't do body counts. 44. Nor does he discuss the U.S. brutalities and blatantly illegal actions in the destruction of Fallujah in 2004. 45. The cold-blooded killing in 2005 of 24 Iraqi civilians by U.S. Marines in the city of Haditha and its long cover-up. 46. Or former U.S. Afghanistan Force Commander Gen. Stanley McChrystal's admission before his own troops in 2010 that they had shot an amazing number of innocent Afghanis at checkpoints, but to my knowledge, none has ever proven to be a threat. 47. Pinker does mention WikiLeaks, but only once and in relation to what he describes as a previously classified civilian casualty database of the American-led military coalition, that not surprisingly attributed the majority Taliban insurgents rather than coalition forces. He does not discuss the well. 23. Publicized WikiLeaks release of the formerly classified U.S. military video depicting the indiscriminate slaying of over a dozen people in the Iraqi suburb of New Baghdad. 48. Nor does he mention any of WikiLeaks' other substantial troves of documents. 49. In short, for this stream of pro-war apologetics, Pinker relies on pure assertion, the uncritical acceptance of official and implausible claims, and a refusal to report inconvenient evidence. However, when he deals with claims of mass civilian deaths brought about by U.S. policy in Iraq, Pinker becomes much more demanding on the quality of evidence and methodology. One device that he uses here and elsewhere is to distinguish between the aggression-based killings by the United States during the initial stage he calls quick and low-in-battle deaths, and deaths during the intercommunal violence in the anarchy that followed. He fails to mention the Nuremberg condemnation of aggression that ties it closely to deaths that follow. To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. 50. He ignores the facts that the civil conflicts were unleashed by the U.S. attack, and that the United States was an ongoing and large direct killer long after the mission was declared accomplished by George Bush on May 1, 2003. Fallujah and Haditha were just two of many U.S. inflicted horrors that followed the announcement of an accomplished mission, and the U.S. invader-occupier was also an active manipulator of the civil conflicts that it unleashed. On the assumption that Nuremberg principles apply, this entire death-dealing and hugely violent enterprise is the legal and moral responsibility. 24. Of Pinker's home country leaders, a point that Pinker evades. Pinker goes to some pains to discredit the higher-end mortality estimates for both the Iraqi theater of conflict under the U.S. war and occupation and the Democratic Republic of Congo after its 1996 invasion by Rwanda and Uganda, two key U.S. allies in Central Africa. Specifically, he criticizes the work of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health researchers, published in the British medical journal The Lancet in October 2006, which reported that 655,000 Iraqis had died during the roughly 40-month period from the March 20, 2003 U.S. invasion through July 2006, with some 601,000 of these deaths due to violence. 51. He also criticizes the January 2008 report by the Brussels-based International Rescue Committee and the Burnet Institute of the University of Melbourne, which estimated 5.4 million excess deaths from all causes in the eastern DRC for the period 1998 to April 2007. 52. Pinker asserts that these mortality estimates are not credible, and refers to both of them with the derogatory term revisionist. Revisionist in this case means essentially not in accord with estimates that Pinker prefers. Rather than counting bodies from media reports and non-governmental organizations, Pinker writes, surveyors ask a sample of people whether they know someone who was killed, then extrapolate the proportion to the population as a whole, without meticulous criteria for selecting a sample. Extrapolations to an entire population can be wildly off. Thus in these two cases he rejects a method that is the current standard in epidemiological research and that Pinker himself uses when it serves his methodological purposes, and that in our opinion is the soundest way of estimating mortality rates in large-scale armed conflicts, with their dangerous, high-risk settings. And 25. The frequent unreliability of governmental record-keeping. Pinker and his preferred sources contend that the Johns Hopkins survey suffered from a Main Street bias that caused a substantial overestimation of Iraqi deaths. 53. These critics fail to mention that the Johns Hopkins team deliberately excluded the city of Fallujah from their sample. Fallujah had suffered two major U.S. military assaults in 2004, the second, in November and December, having devastated the city of some 250,000 people. When the Johns Hopkins team carried out its first survey of Iraqi mortality rates in September 2004, no fewer than two-thirds of all the violent deaths that it found for all of Iraq were reported in just one cluster of households in Fallujah. The researchers decided to exclude the Fallujah data from their 2004 mortality estimate, believing that its inclusion would skew the overall results. 54. And when they carried out their second, more extensive survey in 2006, they excluded Fallujah altogether. This gave their estimate a substantial downward bias. 55. Pinker prefers the estimates produced by Iraq Body Count, an organization that relies largely on newspaper reports, and admittedly undercounts deaths with this unscientific methodology. 56. For the same period covered by the Johns Hopkins study, IBC estimated 53,373 Iraqi deaths due to violence, 57 making the Johns Hopkins estimate of deaths caused by violence more than 11 times greater than the IBC's. As Gilbert Burnham, who led the second of the Johns Hopkins teams, observes, "I can't think of any country that would estimate its national mortality rates by obituary notices in the newspapers." 58 Pinker also favors the 2008 report by the Iraq Family Health Survey Study Group, essentially, by employees of the puppet government of the U.S. military occupation, that estimated 26. The number of violent deaths in Iraq to have been 151,000 from March 2003 through June 2006. 59 Unlike the Johns Hopkins team, the Iraq Family Health Survey did not request copies of death certificates from surviving family members to help verify their claims, and the field research was carried out by employees of highly politicized Iraqi ministries serving under the U.S. occupation regime. So again, here as elsewhere, Pinker uses the preferential method of research, selecting his sources on the basis of their congenial findings, accepting methodologies that are often laughable, and admonishing researchers who come up with the wrong conclusions for the technical flaws in methods entirely ignored by the truthers. In what on Pinkerian logic might be described as the ultimate in revisionism, Pinker completely ignores the sanctions of mass destruction imposed on Iraq by the UN but under U.S. dominant influence and command, which in varying degrees of severity lasted from August 1990 into the U.S. invasion occupation of 2003. It has been estimated that these sanctions may have caused 1 million Iraqi deaths, and in a notable incident, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Madeleine Albright said in a 60 Minutes interview in 1996 that the sanctions-based deaths of an estimated 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. 60 In another notable statement on the Iraq sanctions, John Mueller and Carl Mueller wrote in the journal Foreign Affairs that this sanctions regime caused more deaths than all so-called weapons of mass destruction throughout history. 61 U.S. officials knew that their destruction of Iraqi sanitation and water facilities by bombing raids during the 1991 war might well cause disease and deaths, but this did not impede the bombing or prevent the follow-up refusal to allow Iraq to buy replacement equipment during the sanctions era. 62 Pinker never mentions these unangelic 27 sanctions and this massive death toll. And though he thanks John Mueller in his preface to Better Angels and cites Mueller 20 times in his index and lists 10 different works by Mueller in his references, Pinker somehow misses Mueller's co-authored Foreign Affairs article that throws grisly light on a major case of mass killing but by the United States, hence invisible to Pinker. Pinker is equally committed to minimizing the human cost of the violence in the DRC, and therefore dismissive of higher-end estimates of mortality rates there. John O'Shea of the Irish Relief Agency Goal has called the DRC the worst humanitarian tragedy since the Holocaust. 63 And Reuters contends that the war in the DRC has claimed at least 10 times as many lives as the December tsunami yet remains almost unheard of outside of Africa. 64 As of 2005, the eastern DRC already had suffered a decade of violence, and the August 2010 UN mapping exercise on the most serious violations of human rights in the DRC reported that the apparently systematic and widespread nature of the attacks, which targeted very large numbers of Rwandan Hutu refugees and members of the Hutu civilian population, resulting in their death, reveal a number of damning elements that, if they were proven before a competent court, could be classified as crimes of genocide. 65. But Pinker's preferred sources on the DRC: the International Peace Research Institute of Oslo, Norway, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden, and the Human Security Report Project at Simon Fraser University in Canada are alike in contending that, in Pinker's words, the IRC Burnett estimate was inflated by about 35 times the PRIO battle death estimate, and by more than 6 times the estimate produced by the HSRP. In their reliance on 28. Public sources such as international and non-governmental organizations, and most important, news agencies. 66. The passive surveillance methods employed by both PRIO and UCDP parallel Iraq body counts methods, and HSRP largely depends on the work of PRIO and UCDP. But no matter how many different media sources one checks, even working from comprehensive databases such as Factiva and Nexus, this is a limited and unscientific methodology, almost guaranteed to yield undercounts, especially in large-scale, multi-year theaters of conflict such as the DRC and Iraq. With its estimates of mortality restricted to the category of battle-related deaths, 67, we believe that the adoption of this methodology is motivated to serve political ends. Following the lead of the Human Security Report Projects 2009/2010 The Causes of Peace and the Shrinking Costs of War, Pinker charges the IRC Burnett estimate with working from a pre-war death rate that was far too low, and subtracting it from an estimate of the rate during the war that was far too high. 68 The HSRP, Pinker adds, cautions against accepting estimates of excess deaths from retrospective survey data, since in addition to all of their sampling pitfalls, they require dubious conjectures about what would have happened if a war had not taken place. The IRC Burnett researchers produced compelling replies to these charges, pointing out that even if they had used the higher baseline mortality rate of 2.0 deaths per 1,000 preferred by HSRP and Pinker, the estimated deaths would be 3.3 million since 1998, 69, nearly 4 times as many as the HSRP's best estimate of 860,000 deaths for the shorter period from May 2001 through April 2007. 70 But these competing claims have 29. No bearing on a separate survey on behalf of the UN, which had already estimated that through September 2002, some 3.5 million excess deaths had occurred in the eastern provinces as a direct result of the occupation of the DRC by Rwanda and Uganda. 71 We should add that, just as the Johns Hopkins surveys excluded Fallujah, thereby injecting a conservative factor into their results, the IRC Burnett survey excluded from its samples locations where the violence and the risk to the researchers were greater than in the locations included in the samples, giving the IRC Burnett results a conservative tilt as well. But something else is almost surely at work behind Pinker's advocacy for lower death tolls in Iraq and the DRC, and his reliance on sources that attack the work of researchers who have produced the higher-end estimates. Namely, his new peace and waning of war agenda requires it. Two large-scale bloodbaths like those in Iraq and the DRC must be downsized to fit his agenda. Pinker therefore locates the lower-end numbers that he wants, ignores the sanctions of mass destruction in Iraq, attributes responsibility for the Iraq invasion occupation deaths to intercommunal violence, thereby taking the United States off the hook, and clings to a battle death estimate for the DRC that ignores the many more indirect deaths from malnutrition and otherwise treatable diseases that characterized life in the eastern DRC over much of the past 2 decades, and comprise the major component of the DRC toll. Afghanistan. In the case of Afghanistan, once again Pinker's apologetics for his own country's violence is noteworthy. He tells us that as in Iraq the interstate war phase was quick. 30. But he fails to mention that the follow-up pacification process involved continued warfare and violence for at least the next decade, and was hardly intrastate. It was mainly military operations by the United States, helped along by its NATO allies, and extending into warfare operations in Pakistan. This not very quick assault was sufficiently violent and inept to provide the basis for a Taliban recovery and resurgence. Amusingly, and paralleling his claims about the new humanitarian aspirations of the Marines in Iraq, Pinker also finds a new ethical component in U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, with humanitarian protocols applicable to the anti-Taliban bombing campaign. He quotes a Wired magazine article 72 about a Human Rights Watch report written by senior military analyst Mark Garlasco that lauded the U.S. Air Force for its very good record of minimizing harm to civilians. 73 William Arkin, a leading Human Rights Watch analyst who has also taught at the U.S. Air Force School of Advanced Air Power Studies, puts the word victims in quotation marks when referring to Afghan civilian casualties, and he resents the excessive attention given this subject. Arkin asks Afghans, when are you going to pay the US for the cost of the bombs and the jet fuel and the American lives selflessly given to topple the Taliban and rout Al-Qaeda, all done so that you can have a future? 74. Before joining HRW, Mark Garlasco was for some years a target selector for the US Air Force. The use of such analysts helps us understand why HRW is notorious for its apologetics for US wars and for its consistently low-end estimates of casualties inflicted by US forces. 75. Given this, and Pinker's bias, it does not surprise that while Pinker was quick to contest the methods and findings of the Johns Hopkins Group on Iraq and the IRC Burnett Report on the DRC, he raises no questions about HRW's methodology. He also completely ignores alternative sources. 31. That claim larger numbers of civilian killings in Afghanistan. Most notably, he never mentions Mark Harold's detailed studies of these numbers, which yielded at least triple HRW's estimates and pointed to targeting practices that assured a high civilian toll. In one study, Harold identified 12 mosques struck by U.S. bombs just between October 10 and December 20, 2001, only 2 claimed by the Pentagon to have been mistakes. Harold listed by name several hundred separate villages struck by U.S. bombs, some repeatedly, all of which suffered civilian casualties. His count of documented deaths ran to over 3,000 just between October 7, 2001 and March 30, 2002. 76. The idea that most of these civilians were killed by errant bombs or targeting errors is not credible. They were killed in accord with a deliberate policy of sending missiles to, and dropping bombs on, targets in populated areas based on reports of a Taliban or Al-Qaeda presence. Every vehicle is a target for the American bombers as they hunt down the stragglers of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, Suzanne Goldenberg reported from Zawar, an area of mountain hamlets where the villagers described to her the indiscriminate devastation they suffered. The village is completely flattened. My house was destroyed and my neighbors were killed, the dead remain there in the village. Everybody else has left. 77. One air assault was based on the sighting of a tall man who seemed to be authoritative, therefore maybe Bin Laden, and no more information was needed to kill 6 peasants. Pinker not only ignores such alternative sources as these, he ignores statements by U.S. officials themselves that suggest that humanitarian protocols were PR for the benefit of the media and people like Pinker. This is an area of enormous sympathy for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, said. 32. General Gregory Newbold, about the killings at the wedding ceremony at Kakrok, or the people in the vicinity clearly were connected to those activities, as Donald Rumsfeld said about a mass killing of civilians at Karam village, or even that the people there are dead because we wanted them dead, as an unidentified Pentagon official asserted on CNN about the scores of civilian killed at Chowkerkeres. 78. The media never pressed them on such remarks or considered their relevance to evaluating Pentagon claims of care to avoid civilians. And of course Steven Pinker never mentions them any more than he does Harold. Genocide. In his treatment of genocide, Pinker's selectivity, his focus on Western target victims and neglect of the victims of the West itself, and his gullible and ignorant treatment of the facts are remarkable. For example, he repeatedly refers to Bosnian deaths in 1992 to 1995 as a case of genocide, and at one point he gives 225,000 as the number of victims. Although he writes in an accompanying endnote that the Bosnian massacres probably killed closer to 100,000 than 200,000 people, 79 in his text, he adds parenthetically that though recent studies have shown that some of may be overestimates, we'll stick with the data sets in which the overestimates are to be found. But 2 establishment studies of the deaths in Bosnia during the 1992 to 1995 period of armed conflict, one undertaken on behalf of the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the other funded by the Norwegian government, respectively, lowered the earlier propaganda-based estimates of Bosnian deaths on all sides to 100,000, and Bosnian Muslim civilians killed to approximately 33,000. 80. Furthermore, when Pinker 33 introduces the topic of genocide, he speaks of the awfulness that someone would want to slaughter millions of innocents, including women, children, and the elderly, shocks the imagination by the sheer number of its victims. But Bosnia hardly involved millions, and in the most famous episode there, at Srebrenica in July 1995, the Serbs bust all the women, children, and elderly to safety. Pinker also follows the party line on Rwanda. He takes it as unquestionable that mass killings of 1994 were a Hutu-based slaughter of 700,000 Tutsis, in just 4 months by about 10,000 men with machetes, and that poor Bill Clinton was haunted by his own failure to act to stop the killings. Pinker is clearly unaware of the fact that Clinton did act to get the UN to remove its troops just as the mass killing was escalating in April 1994, contrary to the desires of the Hutu leaders, but in line with the demands and interests of the U.S. supported and militarily dominant Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by the Tutsi Paul Kagame. 81 Pinker is also evidently ignorant of the facts that Paul Kagame was responsible for the April 6, 1994 shooting down of the jet-carrying Hutu President Juvenal Habyarimana that triggered the mass killing, that Kagame's forces moved into action within 2 hours of the shootdown, and easily conquered Rwanda within 100 days, and that the Clinton administration then and U.S. officials now are staunch supporters of the Kagame regime. 82 There is good reason to believe that more Hutus than Tutsis were killed during this Kagame conquest of state power in Rwanda. 83 Pinker also fails to tie this successful U.S. supported conquest and genocide with the sequel Kagame invasion of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was the second U.S. supported genocide in this region. It is no coincidence that here also, as with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Pinker takes issue with higher-end estimates. 34. Of the death toll. Each of the Iraq cases the sanctions of mass destruction, then the U.S. invasion occupation involved vastly larger killings than in Bosnia, but they were initiated and largely carried out by the wrong parties, so we will not find the word genocide applied to these cases by Steven Pinker. It is amusing to read his description of a world aghast at Saddam Hussein's swallowing of Kuwait and making short work of pushing him out. But although millions marched in the streets before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Pinker shows not the slightest indignation at this attack, and he fails to note that although the public may have been aghast at the prospect of the violence of choice by his government, there was no effort to push Bush out of that invaded, occupied, and devastated country. Pinker is aligned with his leaders here, and uses a word like aghast, as with genocide, only when it is consistent with their actions. A much larger number of civilians were killed in the 600-plus massacres of Mayan Indians in Guatemala in the early 1980s than during the civil wars in Bosnia, 1992 to 1995, with the total number of Mayan victims uncertain but possibly 200,000 or more. These killings, which included many women and children, were described in a 1999 Truth Commission report as scorched earth operations, planned by the state, in the complete extermination of many Mayan communities. 84 This Truth Commission concluded that many massacres and other human rights violations committed against these groups obeyed a higher, strategically planned policy, manifested in actions which had a logical and coherent sequence, adding that agents of the state of Guatemala, within the framework of counterinsurgency operations carried out between 1981 and 1983, committed 35 acts of genocide against groups of Mayan people. 85 But Guatemala is and was a U.S. client state, and the killings in Guatemala are never mentioned anywhere in Pinker's book. Pinker also fails to discuss the 1975 Indonesian invasion of East Timor in his section on genocide. The death toll from this 24-year military campaign against the former Portuguese colony after it had won its independence was perhaps 200,000 people overall, and for the most violent years, from 1975 through 1981, between 150,000 and 170,000 out of an initial population of approximately 700,000. 86 This means that over a quarter of the Timorese may have perished at that time, 87 making East Timor the #1 case of genocide since World War II, its percentage toll exceeding that of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and vastly greater than that of the famines in the Soviet Union and China during the Stalin and Mao years. But in Better Angels, Pinker mentions East Timor twice only and with great brevity and apologetic slant. The first time he tells his readers that the Indonesian takeover of East Timor was a case of conquest that eventually was reversed, sparing them any information on the casualties there or any negative language attaching to Indonesia. The second time he mentions East Timor, Pinker asserts that the infamous civil wars and genocides of the 1990s were largely perpetrated by gangs of drugged or drunken hooligans. For Pinker to list East Timor among the civil wars in this manner is to engage once more in a multi-level deception. There was no civil war in East Timor at any time from 1975 through 1999, when the Timorese finally freed themselves from Indonesia, but rather an initial war of resistance and a later war of liberation to throw off the Indonesian occupation and yoke, and the so-called hooligans rampaging across East Timor in the late 36. 1990s were agents of Indonesia, trained by the Indonesians, on their payroll, and under their general command. Nowhere in his book does Pinker mention that it was the Indonesian army that carried out the mass killings that began in East Timor in 1975. Nor does he mention that this invasion and occupation were supported by the United States right from the start, 88, a fact that might explain his lack of interest in this real genocide. Pinker does mention a regression analysis of 122 civil wars between 1945 and 1999, whose authors explain why they categorized the Timorese resistance to Indonesia's military occupation as a civil war. If a state seeks to incorporate and govern territory that is not a recognized state, we consider it a civil war only if the fighting continues after the state begins to govern the territory. 89. So here Pinker manages to find a source that rationalizes Indonesia's invasion occupation, and buries its genocidal results beneath some fabricated notion of a civil war. Indonesia could not have invaded East Timor, because in 1975 East Timor was not a recognized state, even though the Timorese went on fighting and dying after Indonesia seized their territory by force, and international law is explicit that no territorial acquisition or special advantage resulting from aggression is or shall be recognized as lawful. 90. South Viaduct, his preferred source, Pinker ignores the law on aggression. Pinker also misses the fact that Indonesia's invasion and genocidal rampage across this tiny island was motivated by Timor's offshore oil reserves, a case of aggressive commerce driven home by the 1989 Timor Gap Oil Treaty between Indonesia and Australia, a treaty that granted Australian firms the right to drill in the oil-rich Indonesian province of East Timor. 91. Hence unmentionable by Pinker. 37. Terrorism. Pinker mentions terrorism frequently in Better Angels, and as with genocide, devotes a section to the topic, but here again he sticks closely to the party line of the Western establishment, in which terror is violence carried out only by non-state actors and opponents of the West, engaging in asymmetrical warfare, a tactic of the weak against the strong, and striving to attract attention to their cause. However, there is also a tactic of the strong against the weak called state terrorism, sometimes called wholesale as opposed to retail terrorism. 92. But Pinker ignores it, although state terrorism involves the killing of more people and the use of more ferocious means of violence such as torture than does the non-state terrorism on which Pinker focuses. 93. Thus Pinker never allows that U.S. shock and awe bombing or other direct or indirect attacks on civilian sites such as are now carried out by remote-controlled aerial gunships, or Israeli attacks on the occupied Palestinian territories, as in Israel's 2009 war on the Gaza Palestinians, where schools and hospitals were targeted and some 1,400 Palestinians killed, were acts of terrorism, although these attacks were designed to traumatize the population as well as kill people. Nor does the extremely violent nature of U.S. and Israeli actions cause him to use other invidious words, such as aggression or mass murder, to describe them. No, it is implied that the U.S. and Israeli violence is in some way justified, whether defensive, or policing actions, or perhaps retaliation, so words like terrorism, murder, and genocide are reserved for the actions of Western targets. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has defined terrorism as the deliberate and systematic murder of 38 innocent civilians to inspire fear for political ends. 94 and U.S. law defines it even more explicitly according to its intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population and to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. 95 Netanyahu and U.S. lawmakers like their definitions because they allow a focus of attention on victims of hijackings and shootings in airports, who are frequently not even known to the terrorists and clearly innocent. But the civilians killed by U.S. forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, or by Israel in its Gaza bombing raids, or in army and death squad slaughters in Guatemala and Sri Lanka, are also innocents, and they vastly outnumber the highly publicized victims of hijackers and airport attackers. These considerations are ignored by Pinker as he follows the party line in using this invidious word. Islamic violence. Pinker's treatment of the Muslim world is also perfectly aligned with that of his government's and Israel's policy, and seriously misrepresents past and current events. In what we regard as no better than an anti-Muslim rant, he devotes 6 pages to Islam's alleged historical, political, and cultural backwardness, as well as to its violent proclivities and even its genocidal ideology. 96. He imagines 4 threats to the new peace, and assesses their likelihood. These include a civilizational clash with Islam, nuclear terrorism, a nuclear Iran, and climate change. Although he dismisses the gravity of the last 3, Pinker believes that the first of them, militant Islamism, as he calls it in one place, poses the gravest threat to international peace and security going forward. In a remarkable feat of suppressing facts that conflict with 39. His beliefs, Pinker never mentions that it has been centuries since a regime governing a Muslim population has attacked the territory of a Western country, and that there is no Muslim regime in the world today that occupies a Western country. No Muslim regime administers an international network of rendition and torture centers, though some do participate in the U.S. organized spider's web that does these things. 97 No Muslim regime sends remote-controlled aerial gunships to strike targets in the United States or its allies. Nor, in contrast to the sanctions imposed by Western regimes during the past 2 decades on Muslim countries such as Libya, Iraq, Somalia, the Sudan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Syria, the Muslim world has not held a Western country under economic siege. These are among the many categories of mass violence and criminality that the Muslim world does not need to outgrow, because no Muslim regime is guilty of engaging in them. Though about 1/5 of the world's population is Muslim, Pinker writes, and about 1/4 of the world's countries have a Muslim majority, more than half of the armed conflicts in 2008 embroiled Muslim countries or insurgencies. But was Poland embroiled in an armed conflict with Germany in 1939? Was Lebanon embroiled with Israel in 1982 and again in 2006? Can a street victim be embroiled with his assailant? Pinker's use of the word embroiled in relation to Muslim countries or insurgencies obscures the difference between perpetrator and victim, such that the victim appears as a co-belligerent in an armed conflict. Here Pinker is echoing the work of Pryo, UCDP, HSRP, and other researchers closely aligned with a decades-old US and Western agenda, accepting that, in the words of Pryo's Nils Petter Gleditsk, in the general trend towards more peace, Muslim countries and Islamic opposition groups 40 seem to be lagging behind. 98 In an endnote, Pinker cites the UCDP Pryo database for 2008, 99, and lists the 19 armed conflicts that he alleges involved a Muslim country, but he fails to mention that in many of the 19 cases listed, the United States or its clients also were crucially implicated. 100 These were either armed movements resisting violent U.S. and Allied-directed state repression in countries where the victim population is Muslim, or U.S. and Allied-supported insurgencies that fly Islamic banners in countries where the United States seeks to destabilize a regime. In another endnote, Pinker writes that 30 of 44 foreign terrorist organizations in the U.S. State Department's Country Reports on Terrorism 2008 were Muslim terrorist organizations, underscoring yet again his Islam equals violence theme, while in this case parroting the State Department's official designation of who engages in terrorism, and who suffers from it. 101. The UCDP PRIO database upon which Pinker relies is systematically and crudely biased. Thus, for example, it lists the U.S.-led war and occupation in Afghanistan for 2008 as an internationalized internal armed conflict 102 between the government of Afghanistan and two opposition groups, the Hezb-i-Islam and the Taliban. 103 The armed forces of the United States and indeed the entire NATO bloc are classified as secondary parties to this conflict, 104 merely lending their support to an Afghan government that is a puppet they installed following the October 2001 invasion of the country, and continued to prop up through 2008. Similarly, for 2008, the UCDP PRIO lists the U.S.-led war and occupation in Iraq as an internationalized internal armed conflict between the government of Iraq and two opposition groups, the Al-Mahdi Army and the Umbrella Organization. 41. Known as the Islamic State of Iraq, which includes Al-Qaeda as well as several other armed resistance groups. 105 Here again the UCDP PRIO classified the U.S. and Allied role in Iraq as that of secondary parties to the conflict, lending their support to the Iraqi government, rather than as the invader-occupier that had driven the previous regime from power and unleashed huge and ongoing violence in the country. But for the UCDP PRIO as well as for Pinker, Afghanistan and Iraq were two of the 19 theaters where alleged Islamic conflicts were taking place in 2008, and this helps to show that an increasing proportion of the world's armed conflicts have involved Islamic countries and insurgencies over the past 2 decades, while the rest of the world got more peaceful. This carries Pinker beyond the preferential method of research. In contrast with the UCDP, PRIO, and Pinker, Robert Pape and his project on security and terrorism at the University of Chicago have shown that the number one factor instigating what Pinker mislabels Islamic violence is not something about Islam, but about the fact that the United States wages wars against Islamic countries, militarily occupies them, terrorizes and kills lots of Islamic peoples, and frequently supports dictatorships in their countries to enforce the political outcomes it wants. Beside terrorism such as that of 9/11 is particularly sensitive to foreign military occupation, and not Islamic fundamentalism or any ideology independent of this crucial circumstance, Pape writes in a summary of his findings. Total suicide attacks worldwide have risen dramatically since the launching of the wars on Afghanistan and Iraq from about 300 from 1980 to 2003, to 1,800 from 2004 to 2009. Over 90% of suicide attacks worldwide are now anti-American. 106 So-called militant Islamism is not a cause of violence inside Muslim countries, much less. 42. An endogenous variable in the modern world, to use the kind of language Pinker enjoys, but a simple effect of the many decades of brutal and bloody Western interference in them and, crucially, the U.S.-led NATO bloc's ratcheting up of its violence since the collapse of the Soviet bloc and especially since 2001. In another classic of misrepresentation, Pinker writes that in defiance of the rising tide of democracy, only about a quarter of Islamic countries elect their governments, and most of them are only dubiously democratic. The laws and practices of many Muslim countries seem to have missed out on the humanitarian revolution. Pinker fails to mention that for decades the United States and its allies have supported unelected governments in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Kuwait, Bahrain, Morocco, Tunisia, Pakistan, and even Iraq, that they overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953, and installed a dictatorship, that they rejected the results of free elections in Palestine in 2006 won by Hamas, imposed sanctions on the Gaza Palestinians to punish them, and launched covert operations against Hamas, 107 and that the Arab contributions to the global spring were and remain largely outbursts of popular revolts against unelected, U.S.-supported and aided regimes. 108 This is one more case of the civilized West working to decivilize the weaker societies, but Pinker claims that the consequences are all rooted in Islamic culture. The Muslim world is sitting out the decline of violence, Pinker writes. More than 2 decades of headlines have shocked Westerners with acts of barbarity in the name of Islam. His catalogue of headline-grabbing barbarisms include the 1989 clerical death threat against Salman Rushdie, the fatal stabbing in 2004 of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh, the lethal 43. 2005 riots after a Danish newspaper printed editorial cartoons that were disrespectful to the Prophet, and, of course, 9/11. Here again Pinker takes the Western media's headlines and choruses of moral outrage as unbiased, and he apparently believes that equivalent or far more deadly events that they do not feature are properly downplayed or ignored. But if the New York Times and CNN rank the threat of violence against Salman Rushdie as more important and newsworthy than the actual U.S. bombing of mosques in Afghanistan, or warehouses bearing Red Cross insignia, or wedding parties, or broadcasting facilities, or episodes of mass killing in Iraq and the growing evidence of extensive genetic damage to babies born in Fallujah since the city of some 250,000 inhabitants was destroyed by U.S. forces in 2004, 109. This speaks far more to the U.S. and Western media's biases and propagandistic role than it does to the inherent importance of the Rushdie affair. No serious analyst or scholar would take U.S. media headline treatment as the proper and authentic measure of the importance of global events. The impression that the Muslim world indulges kinds of violence that the West has outgrown is not a symptom of Islamophobia or Orientalism but is borne out by the numbers, Pinker reassures us. The historian Bernard Lewis is not the only one who has asked, what went wrong? Whatever the historical reasons, a large chasm appears to separate Western and Islamic cultures today. In fact, the chasm was Western created, and what really went wrong over the past 2 centuries was that the West developed far more lethal military weapons than did Islamic regimes, and Western regimes have long been deploying these lavishly against Islamic territories and peoples, who 44. Have suffered far greater losses than their more violent and domineering tormentors. But now these victimized peoples are standing up against the undemocratic and repressive regimes sponsored and supported by the civilized. They seek their own humanitarian revolution, though they continue to run up against Western interests, interventions, and growing Islamophobia. Pinker proudly carries the Western torch against militant Islam and helps enlarge the chasm. Class, race, and the science of self-control. It should come as no surprise that in a work defending the imperial states as benevolent, with declining rates of violence internally and the alleged democratic peace between them serving as a model for the lesser peoples and powers of the world, we find a racist underpinning. The rights revolutions are the liberal revolutions, Pinker tells us. Each has been associated with liberal movements, and each is currently distributed along a gradient that runs, more or less, from Western Europe to the blue American states to the red American states to the democracies of Latin America and Asia and then to the more authoritarian countries, with Africa and most of the Islamic world pulling up the rear. We doubt that the canonical Orientalist map of the world has ever been expressed more succinctly. 110. Within the Western imperial powers, Pinker believes that a similar process runs from the earliest civilizers among the upper strata of society downward to the lower strata of the socio-economic scale, the savages in whom the civilizing process never fully penetrated, with many of them ending up behind bars where Pinker thinks a lot of them belong. 111 He 45. Acknowledges that the civilizing process did not eliminate violence altogether but, he adds, it did relegate it to the socio-economic margins. As it spread not only downward along the socio-economic scale, but outward across the geographic scale, from a Western European epicenter. 112. Pinker's notion of the civilizing process is based in part on his reading of a book originally published in Germany in 1939, titled The Civilizing Process, Sociogenetic and Psychogenetic Investigations. 113 This book's author, Norbert Elias, Pinker calls the most important thinker you have never heard of. Something called self-control is the central component of this alleged process. Better Angels contains many paeans to self-control. Conveniently for Pinker's decline of violence stories, Self-control is a fuzzy notion, a many-headed metaphor that, like terrorism, can be used as a weapon either to denigrate targets or to cover up the sins of favored parties. Pinker maintains that self-control is a variable trait that is heritable, and that those who possess more self-control generally do better in the world than do those who possess less of it. Following Elias, he argues that the consolidation of states in Europe and an economic revolution that replaced zero-sum plunder with positive Jum cooperation were the two exogenous factors that triggered the civilizing process over many centuries, and reduced homicide rates. And to prosper within that whole, Pinker adds, one had to cultivate faculties of empathy and self-control until they became, as put it, second nature. 46. Pinker has no serious evidence for this neatly tailored story, even though his sources' evidence for the decline in homicide rates in European countries over many centuries is solid. 114. Nevertheless, he goes on to devote a section of his book to the so-called science of self-control. Lapses of self-control can cause violence on a larger scale, he tells us. The burning and looting of African American neighborhoods by their own residents following the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, and Israel's pulverizing of the infrastructure of Lebanon following a raid by Hezbollah in 2006, are just two examples. But might not the widespread riots that occurred after King's death have been the final result of unbearable social conditions needing only a spark to ignite them, as were the major riots 4 years earlier in New York City, North Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, and not the result of some kind of maladaptive impulses among the rioting savages? Was the July-August 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon really an uncontrolled response to a provocation, or was the alleged provocation an excuse for an already planned, large-scale military action? In each of these cases, Pinker's lapses of self-control substitutes a psychologizing about what makes human individuals tick for serious institutional analysis. The results are gross misrepresentations of history. In his 1997 book, How the Mind Works, Pinker had likened IQ to some crude consumer index, and observed dismissively of James Q. Wilson and Richard Herrenstein's 1985 book Crime and Human Nature that they attributed to low intelligence. Neither innate nor historical differences were at the forefront of Pinker's 700-page tract. His definition of intelligence as an ability to attain goals in the face of obstacles by means of decisions based on rational rules made no use of IQ. Nor did he discuss intelligence in relation to racial categories that have 47. Long been at the forefront of the mismeasures of man, and conspicuously display racist biases. 115. But in his 2002 book The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, Pinker sought to vindicate in the language of evolutionary biology whole sets of junk scientific claims about human psychology as well as the economic, social, and political arrangements that he prefers. This was especially clear in his attacks on what he called the hard left ideology of the radical science movement of the previous 3 decades, whose partisans had criticized sociobiology 116 and whom Pinker accused of running from scientific truths about the innate differences among people, because they feared the political implications these differences might entail. 117 Moral and scientific doctrines have been so badly conflated, he charged, that genuine discoveries about human nature greeted with fear and loathing because they were thought to threaten progressive ideals. Indeed, politically motivated reactions to the new sciences of human nature sought to deny that such a thing as human nature exists. 118. In contrast with his earlier views on this subject, Pinker now treated IQ as a real trait that can vary, not as a reification unrelated to the brain, personality, and social behavior without any genetic basis. In his successive misrepresentations of Stephen Jay Gould and a work jointly authored by Richard Lewontin, Stephen Rose, and Leon Kamin. 119. Of course none of these figures nor any other serious figure from the history of inquiry into human affairs has ever believed anything like the blank slate conjured up by Pinker. But it was rhetorically necessary for him to pretend that blank slatists were running the academy and policing its fields of research into human psychology and behavior so that he could ride to the rescue of the new discoveries the old 48. Sociobiology and its more recent adaptationist offshoots. 120. Now Richard Herrenstein's work was not dismissed but cited favorably. Pinker wrote that Herrenstein's work on IQ in particular, as expressed by his notorious syllogism, should be accepted because it is banal rather than controversial, and based on a mathematical necessity, as the proportion of variance in social status caused by non-genetic factors goes down, the proportion caused by genetic factors has to go up, hence a society becomes more just, it will also become more stratified along genetic lines. Smarter people will tend to float into the higher strata, and their children will tend to stay there. 121 That the numbers for all factors, and the IQ tests themselves, reflect self-fulfilling cultural influences, is rejected by Pinker, as he fully embraces a crude biological determinism. Also, he never suggests that the Herrenstein-Murray findings might reflect a hard right bias favoring policies that protect class and racist inequities, cutbacks in social spending, and an end to affirmative action type programs. These writers are serious scientists, after all, like Pinker himself, not human nature denying, politically driven leftists. People who commit crimes are those with the least self-control, Pinker writes, mentioning again the work of Richard Herrenstein and James Q. Wilson, along with others who engage in the classic method of blaming the victims. Self-control is partly correlated with intelligence, Pinker continues. Intelligence itself is highly correlated with crime. Duller people commit more violent crimes and are more likely to be the victims of a violent crime. But Pinker is referring to street crimes only, not the crimes of speculators, self-dealing looters, or war criminals, all of whom are exempt. 49. From Pinker's analysis of self-control, unless they stick up a 7-11 or shoot somebody in a crack cocaine turf war. Organisms are equipped with an internal variable, like an adjustable interest rate, that governs how steeply they discount the future, Pinker writes, citing the work of Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. The shorter the expected lifespan, the higher the rate of violent crime. But doesn't street crime also correlate with poverty and the systematic lack of educational and job alternatives for an underclass? And when one shifts one's perspective to the higher violent crimes, like making war and killing people with troops and bombs in cities from Hiroshima to Fallujah, how would Pinker explain the ferocity of the larger-scale violence of Harry Truman, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and David Petraeus, given their longer expected lifespans? I think Wilson was onto something when he linked the 1960s crime boom to a kind of intergenerational decivilizing process, Pinker writes. In many ways the new generation tried to push back against the 8th century movement described by Norbert Elias. Much of what Pinker contends in this and the next section ranks among the most laughable material in Better Angels. The civilizing process had been a flow of norms and manners from the upper classes downward, he continues. But as Western countries became more democratic, the upper classes became increasingly discredited as moral paragons, and hierarchies of taste and manners were leveled. Pinker claims that as U.S. society became more egalitarian and democratic, it also became less civilized. Then he argues later that as U.S. society became less egalitarian and democratic, and considerably more repressive and reactionary, it was recivilized. But the 60s saw the height of the U.S. civil rights. 50. Movement, the rise of feminism, and growing demands of ordinary citizens to participate in political decision-making, a crisis of democracy in the eyes of elites and, in their corner, Steven Pinker. 122. Pinker quotes both Charles Murray and Daniel Patrick Moynihan to support his view. Any side effect was to undermine the prestige of aristocratic and bourgeois lifestyles that had become less violent than those of the working class and underclass. Instead of values trickling down from the court, they bubbled up from the street, a process that was later called proletarianization and defining deviancy. 123 Moynihan's 1965 report for the Johnson administration, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, with its tangle of pathology rhetoric, and its warning that the matriarchal structure of the Black American family, the reversed roles of husband and wife, spelled doom for black Americans below the middle class. 124 was eventually vindicated, Pinker contends. The decivilizing effects hit African American communities particularly hard. It wasn't until 3 decades later, in the 1990s, that civilizing offensives started to write the listing Leviathan. The homicide rate in the United States was in fact higher in 1980 than in 2010. For Pinker, 2 overarching explanations account for the decline. The first is that the Leviathan got bigger, smarter, and more effective. The second is that the civilizing process, which the counterculture had tried to reverse in the 1960s, was restored to its forward direction. Indeed, it seems to have entered a new phase. In real-world terms, this meant putting more men behind bars for longer periods of time, especially African Americans. 51. It also meant a ballooning of the police in the 1990s. But above all, it meant difficult to quantify cultural and psychological changes that, Pinker believes, can fairly be called a recivilizing process. The licentiousness and informalization and leveling of the 1960s were reversed. Deviancy stopped being defined downward. The perverse incentives of the welfare state were removed. Self-control as a positive value was restored. So was trust in official institutions, cops in particular. The federal and state law enforcement agencies engaged in the second stage of a civilizing process, enhancing the legitimacy of government force. Potential criminals not yet living behind bars learned that the risk of an arrest, conviction, and punishment for illegal conduct was greater than it had been since the mid-1960s. 125 Not only did homicide decline in the 1990s, but so did other indicators of social pathology, such as divorce, welfare dependency, teenage pregnancy, dropping out of school, sexually transmitted disease, and teenage auto accidents and gun accidents. Never mind that by the end of 2010, the adult U.S. prison population stood at 2,266,800, with an additional 7,076,200 adults on parole or probation. 126 racial and ethnic minorities have borne the brunt of this recivilizing process, with blacks and Hispanics accounting for at least 60% of all inmates today. Under the badly mislabeled 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act and the racially discriminatory war on drugs, the number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug crimes rose by 1,137% from 1980 to 2010, and some 2/3 of this exploding prison population were blacks. Although it was finally overturned in June 2012 by the U.S. Supreme Court, 127 more than 25 years of mandatory minimum prison terms for the possession of only 100th as much crack as would similarly penalize the 52. Possession of powdered cocaine caused a situation in which black males had a 1 in 3 chance of winding up behind bars at some point in their lifetimes, compared to 1 in 6 for Hispanic males, and 1 in 17 for white males. 128 By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, roughly 23% of all prisoners in the world languished behind bars in the United States, this country boasting the highest prison population rate in the world. 129 But there are no lamentations from Pinker about the lack of self-control running amok among U.S. lawmakers and the enforcers of the criminal justice system. As one group of critics noted about the rise of the penal state in America, no thug, no dictator, no psychopathic madman anywhere in the world can touch the United States in this department. 130. The criminologist Randall Sheldon has written that the new millennium began as the previous one had ended, with the institutional growth, spread, and deepening of the crime control industry, its many state and private subsidiaries engaged in a self-perpetuating struggle for resources, more inmates, and tax dollars above all. What has occurred during the last 1/3 of the 20th century, Sheldon observes, is that crime and its control has become one of the fastest growing businesses in world history. As the manufacturing base of America has declined, we have seen in its place the rise of a fast-growing service industry. 131. In ranking the order of importance of the 11 factors that contribute to jail overcrowding in the United States, Jerome Miller ranked the actual amount of crime committed 11th overall, dead last. 132. A recivilizing process indeed. Communism versus capitalism. Pinker's establishment ideology kicks in very clearly. 53. In his comparative treatment of communism, on the one hand, and democracy and capitalism, on the other, he is explicit that whereas communism is a utopian and dangerous ideology from which most of the world's serious violence allegedly flowed during the past century, democracy, capitalism, markets, gentle commerce, and the like, are all tied to liberalism, or more exactly to classical liberalism. 133. These institutional forms are not the result of ideologies, much less utopian and dangerous, they are the historically more advanced permutations of the Leviathan that help to elicit those components of the neurobiology of peaceableness for which the human brain has been naturally selected over evolutionary time. Hence, they are sources of the alleged decline in violence, and their spread is a force for positive and more peaceful change in the world. 134. Not so communism. At the outset of Chapter 6, The New Peace, Pinker approvingly quotes Alexander Solzhenitsyn's line that, unlike the communists, Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology driving them. In discussing the alleged mental traits of the members of a society mobilized to commit genocide, he argues that utopian creeds that submerge individuals into moralized categories may take root in powerful regimes and engage their full destructive might, and highlights Marxism during the purges, expulsions, and terror famines in Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao's China, and Pol Pot's Cambodia. In his 2002 book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, he devoted several pages to what he called the Marxist genocides of the 20th century, and noted that historians are currently debating whether the communists' mass executions, forced marches, slave labor, and man-made famines led to 100 million deaths or only 20. 54. 5 million. 135. And in the section of the current book titled The Trajectory of Genocide, Pinker cites the authority of the democratic peace theorist and atrocitologist Rudolf Rummel, who in his 1994 book Death by Government wrote that whereas totalitarian communist governments slaughter their people by the tens of millions, many democracies can barely bring themselves to execute serial murderers. 136. As we have seen, Pinker rewrites history to accommodate this familiar establishment perspective, so that the Cold War was rooted in communist expansionism and U.S. efforts at containment, and the several million deaths in the Korean and Vietnam Wars were attributable to the Communists' fanatical unwillingness to surrender to superior force, not to anti-communist and racist attitudes that facilitated the U.S. military's mass killings of distant peoples. He deals with U.S. state capitalism's support and sponsorship of the corrupt open-door dictatorships of Suharto, Marcos, Mobutu, Pinochet, Diem, the Greek colonels, and the national security states of Latin America, and the burgeoning of torture following the end of the Cold War, by aversion. In Pinker's view, the Third World's troubled areas are suffering from their failure to absorb the civilizing lessons modeled for them in the United States and other advanced countries. He ignores the 8 decades-long massive U.S. investment in the military and ideological training, political takeovers, and subsequent support of Third World dictators in numerous U.S. client terror states, including Guatemala, transformed from a democracy to terror state in 1954, Brazil, shifted from a democracy to military dictatorship in 1964, the Philippines in 1972, and Chile the same in 1973, among many others. A tabulation by one of the present authors in 1979 found that 26 of the 35 states in that era that used torture on an 55 administrative basis were U.S. clients, all of them recipients of U.S. military and economic aid. 137 These clients were capitalist in structure, but threatened and employed force to keep the lower orders disorganized and more serviceable to the local elites and transnational corporations investing there. One Latin American church document of that period spoke of the local U.S. supported regimes as imposing an economic model so repressive that it provoked a revolution that did not exist. 138 This was a deliberate decivilizing process, with the civilized serving as co-managers. We have seen that Pinker finds the modern era peaceful by focusing on the absence of war between the major powers, downplaying the many murderous wars carried out by the West against small countries, and falsely suggesting that the lesser country conflicts are homegrown, even where, as in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was U.S. military assaults that precipitated the internal armed conflicts, with the United States then actively participating in them. The Israeli occupation and multi-decade ethnic cleansing of Palestine he misrepresents as a cycle of deadly revenge, with only Israel fighting against terrorism in this cycle. He speaks of Islamic and communist ideology as displaying violent tendencies, and congratulates the U.S. military for allegedly overcoming the kind of racist attitudes reported at the time of the Vietnam War. But the military's new humanism is another piece of Pinker misinformation and pro-war propaganda. And he fails to cite the numerous instances of Israeli leaders referring to Palestinians as grasshoppers, beasts walking on two legs, crocodiles, insects, and a cancer, or Israeli rabbis decrying them as the Amalekites of the present era, calling for extermination of these unchosen people. 139. 56. As regards Israel, Pinker never mentions the Israeli belief in a promised land and chosen people who may be fulfilling God's will in dispossessing Palestinians. 140 Although the lack of angelic behavior in these assaults and this language, ethnic cleansing, and dispossession process is dramatic, and has had important effects on the attitudes and behavior of Islamic peoples, it fails to fit Pinker's ideological system and political agenda, and therefore is not a case of conflict with ideological roots. For Pinker, there is also nothing ideological in the miracle of the market, no stark utopia in Friedrich von Hayek's assertion that the particulars of a spontaneous order cannot be just or unjust. 141 No ideology in the faith that an unconstrained free market will not produce intolerable inequalities and majority resistance that in turn require the likes of Pinochet, Suharto, or Hitler to reassert the requisite stability. It is simply outside of Pinker's orbit of thought that liberalism and neoliberalism in the post-Soviet world are ideologies that have serviced an elite in a class war, that the major struggles and crises that we have witnessed, over climate change, the massive upward redistribution of income and wealth, the global surge of disposable workers, and the enlargement of NATO and the police and surveillance state, are features of a revitalized consolidation of class power, under more angelic names. Like reform, free markets, flexibility, stability, and fiscal discipline. For Pinker, the huge growth of the prison population shows the lack of self-control of the incarcerated savages still with us, and it is one merit of the liberal state that it gets the bad guys off the streets. Another device that Pinker uses when weighing capitalism versus communism is to take notorious state abuses. 57. Committed in the name of communism, not as perversions of communism, but as inherent in its ideology, and flowing directly from it. Many historians and leftists have long argued that Stalinism constituted a radical betrayal and perversion of genuine communism, and that it emerged out of crises and stresses that made anything approaching genuine communism unreachable. 142 Pinker never addresses this kind of explanation and exemption of real-world communism, but he does this implicitly for real-world degenerate forms of capitalism. Thus, Nazi Germany and its mass murders are not credited to capitalism's account, even though Germany under the Nazis was still capitalist in economic form and surely a variant of capitalism arising under stress and threat from below, with important business support. 143 Suharto's Indonesia and Pinochet's Chile could be said to fit this same pattern. Right-wing believers in the crucial importance of free markets, such as Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, approved of Pinochet's rule, which ended political freedom and freedom of thought, but worked undeviatingly for corporate interests and rights. But it took only 1 decade of the Chicago Boys' privatizations and other reforms for Chile's economy and financial system to collapse. In the harsh depression that ensued, the banks were renationalized and their foreign creditors bailed out in a process sometimes called the Chicago Road to Socialism, but then shortly thereafter they were reprivatized all over again, at bargain basement prices. 144. In one of his book's more outlandish moments, Pinker even allocates Nazism and the Holocaust to communism. He writes that since Hitler read Marx in 1913, Marxism led 58. Definitively if more circuitously to the committed by the Nazi regime in Germany. 145 But while there is no evidence that Hitler really examined Marx or accepted any of his or his fellow Marxist writers' ideas, 146 It is incontestable fact that Hitler held Marxism in contempt, and that communism and communists ranked very high among Hitler's and the Nazis' demons and targets when they held power in Germany. 147 So is the fact that racist theories and mismeasure of man literature in the Houston Stewart Chamberlain tradition of which Richard Herrenstein and Charles Murray arguably are heirs were fanatically embraced by Hitler, and therefore linked to Nazism and not very circuitously, either. Pinker not only doesn't credit the Nazi Holocaust to capitalism, he also fails to give capitalism credit for the extermination of the Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere and the huge death tolls from the slave trades, 148 which should have been prevented by the rising better angels. As noted, he also ignores democratic capitalism's responsibility for the surge of colonialism in the 18th and 19th centuries, the associated holocausts, 149 and the death-dealing and exploitation of the Western-sponsored terror states in Indonesia, the Philippines, Latin America, and elsewhere. He also fails to address the huge toll of structural violence under capitalism flowing from its domestic and global dispossession processes, and, interestingly, intensifying with the post-1979 transformation of China and the breakup of the Soviet bloc and Soviet Union, which reduced any need on the part of Western capitalism to show concern for the well-being of its own working-class majority. This helps explain the significant global increases in inequality and dispossession and slum city enlargement over the past 2 decades, a period that Pinker calls the New Peace and depicts as an age of accelerating civilization. 59. Pinker refers to the deaths during China's Great Leap Forward as a Mao masterminded famine that killed between 20 million and 30 million people. 150 For Pinker, clearly, the dead were victims of a deliberate policy that demonstrates the evil behind communist ideology. But as the development economists Jean Dries and Amartya Sen have pointed out, China under Mao installed a massive and effective system of public medical services, as well as literacy and nutrition programs that greatly benefited the general population in the years prior to the famine, a fact that is difficult to reconcile with the allegation that Mao regarded mass starvation as an acceptable means to some other end. Instead, Dries and Sen blamed this tragedy on the lack of democracy in China, with the absence of pressure from below and a lack of timely knowledge of policy failure significantly offsetting the life-saving benefits of Communist China's medical and other social welfare programs. 151. Dries and Sen also compared the number of deaths caused by this famine under Mao with the number of deaths caused by what they called the endemic undernutrition and deprivation that afflicts India's population year in and year out. Estimates of extra mortality vary from 16.5 million to 29.5 million, they wrote, arguably the largest in terms of total excess mortality in recorded history. 152 But despite the gigantic size of excess mortality in the Chinese famine, they continued, the extra mortality in India from regular deprivation in normal times vastly overshadows the former. Comparing India's death rate of 12 per thousand with China's 7 per thousand, and applying that difference to India's population of 781 million in 1986, we get an estimate of excess normal mortality in India of 3.9 million per year. This implies that every 8 years or so more people die in India because of its higher death rate than died in China in the 60. Gigantic famine. India seems to manage to fill its cupboard with more skeletons every 8 years than China put there in its years of famine. 153 Indeed, by 2005, some 46% of India's children were underweight, and 79% suffered anemia. 40 years of efforts to raise how much food grains Indians are able to eat has been destroyed by a mere dozen years of economic reform, Jawaharlal Nehru University economist Utsa Patnaik observes. 154. China's death rate increased after 1979, with the surge of capitalist reforms and the associated sharp reduction in public medical services. 155. A recent review of China's past and current demographic trends showed that its rate of death was higher in 2010 than in 1982, and that the greatest declines in mortality occurred well prior to the reforms, with a national decline occurring even during the decade that included the famine. 156. So Pinker misrepresents the truths at a number of levels in dealing with the Chinese starvation episode. He avoids the need to reconcile allegedly deliberate starvation deaths with a prior and continuous Chinese state policy of helping the masses by simply not discussing the subject. He ignores the evidence that policy failure and ignorance rather than murderous intent was the source of those deaths. He fails to mention the rise in mortality rates under the post-Mao New Capitalist Order. And Pinker carefully avoids Dries and Sen's China-India comparison, which suggests that every 8 years or so since India won its independence in 1947, its democratic capitalist system may well have caused greater levels of excess mortality than did China under the worst years of its famine, a lesson that could be extrapolated to other theaters of structural violence, were the author's concern with such outcomes less driven by his own ideology. 61. Similarly, while Pinker regularly cites killings and genocide under communist rule in the Soviet Union, he never mentions the huge body count in Russia after the overthrow of communism and the installation of a capitalist state from 1992 onward, with aggressive social re-engineering pressed by the democratic states of the West. This failed crusade 157 was deliberately imposed on Russia, its human costs thought acceptable by Western sponsors and their local collaborators in order to assure the irreversibility of the overthrow of socialism. The destruction of the social welfare and healthcare institutions of communism made Russia perhaps the first country in history to undergo a spike in mortality rates for reasons other than war, famine, or disease, the Russian specialist David Powell wrote in 2002. 158. Noam Chomsky observed that as the UN Development Programme had estimated 10 million excess male deaths during the 1990s, this death toll was approximately the toll of Stalin's purges 60 years earlier. If these figures near accurate, the general collapse so severe that even monstrous Stalin remembered with some appreciation. More than half of Russians believe Stalin's role in Russian history was positive, while only a third disagreed, polls indicated in early 2003. 159. As David Kotz and Fred Weir described the impact of the reforms, there is no place for most of Russia's population in the new economic system. 160. Now more than a decade after this initial flood of human deaths, arguments rage over how far Russia's demographic crisis will cause its national population to fall by 2030 or mid-century, all due to the catastrophic shocks of the 1990s. 161. Not only is there no mention in Better Angels of a Western-sponsored neoliberal shock therapy killing millions of Russians during the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st, but the only Russia that interests Pinker is the one from the early 17th century or the one from early last century, which fought in World War I and ended up with communism. Sources and methods. As we have noted, Pinker employs the preferential method of research, uncritically using sources that support his claims and ideological agenda, and ignoring or criticizing harshly those that take positions incompatible with his. In our favorite example, he often cites John Mueller's work, but never mentions the same author's 1999 article with Carl Mueller that claims the UN's sanctions of mass destruction against Iraq were historically unique mass killers of civilians, a strategic silence almost surely determined by the fact that the US and its democratic allies were the killers. 162. Pinker never mentions Amartya Sen or Jean Dries, both distinguished scholars whose work often covers ground similar to Pinker's in Better Angels, again almost surely because Sen and Dries deal with structural violence under capitalism, do not regard the Mao-era famine in China as a case of deliberate mass killing, and contend that deaths in India under the endemic undernutrition and deprivation of its capitalist system greatly exceeded China's famine deaths. Separately, Sen also stresses the diversity and tradition of tolerance within Islam, as Pinker never does, and writes that the hard sell of Western liberalism notwithstanding, the valuing of freedom is not confined to one culture only, and the Western traditions are not the only ones that prepare us for a freedom-based approach to social understanding. 163 Instead, Pinker and his sources focus only on Islam's backwardness and violent proclivities, and what went wrong. 63. There is no index reference to Sen or Dries in Better Angels, but there are 8 indexed references to Rudolf Rummel in Pinker's book, and 4 works by Rummel are listed in Pinker's bibliography, including the website for Rummel's work at the University of Hawaii. A far-right fanatic, Rummel's blog, A Freedomist View, rivals that of the Birchers. In the first year of the Obama presidency, Rummel called Obama a 1960s anti-war, socialist radical activist who believes in love not war, and he assailed Obama for putting a crimp in the use of torture, thereby undermining intelligence operations by the good guys. Rummel also warned that Obama's plans called for unnecessarily closing Guantanamo detention camp by January 22, 2010 as a sop to world and domestic leftist opinion of fear that has yet to be realized. 164 Rummel even wrote that Obama and his associates were carrying out a coup d'état in the United States, and he was worried that under left-wing pressure the United States might fail to save Afghanistan, just as the left had forced a regrettable U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam 4 decades earlier. 165. In what purports to be his scholarly work, Rummel writes that U.S. democide in war is most difficult to calculate, but finds that a prudent figure may be 5,500 overall. 166 In contrast, he estimated that the communist government of North Vietnam was responsible for 1,669,000 democidal deaths in the war, or more than 300 times as many as killed by the U.S. war machine. This remarkable pair of claims is based on 2 factors: Rummel's requirement that in order for deaths to count as democide, the killing of non-combatants must be carried out by agents acting on behalf of a government, with the clear intent to kill members of a targeted population. 167 And Rummel's own deep ideological belief that whereas communist regimes target and kill non-combatants on a regular and systematic basis, the U.S. government 64 meticulously upholds the laws of war and strives to protect civilians. Free fire zones, 168 high-level saturation bombing, destruction of villages in order to save them, napalm, cluster bombs, the use of 6 times the tonnage of bombs and shells against Vietnam than it used during all of World War II, and the widespread application of chemical weapons to destroy civilian crops, the last causing crippling damage to hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese children. 170 Fail to resonate with Rummel, for whom it remains an article of faith that the United States did not deliberately harm civilians in the war. Had many sources label as atrocities or massacres may, by the Geneva Conventions and other accepted rules of warfare, be legitimate military actions or accidents of war, he counters. Indeed, the most important fact of this bombing was the scrupulous care with which targets were selected and bombed, with the United States limiting attacks to purely military targets. Civilians were killed, he concedes, but these deaths were collateral to bombing military targets. 171 These are truths that Rummel accepts for no reason other than that they pertain to his government and to the communist enemy, and possess a kind of self-evident status for him. This is extreme fanaticism masquerading as scholarship. In contrast with Sen and Dries, Rummel writes that more than 35 million people were murdered in the Chinese communist anthill, and of the famine victims he writes that 27 million starved to death, every one of them sacrificed for the most massive, total social engineering projects ever forced on any society in modern history. 172 But Rummel says what Pinker wants to hear, so while Sen is ignored, Rommel is promoted to serious authority and his 65 numbers are used profusely and uncritically in Better Angels. In a similar fashion, Pinker makes lavish use of the estimates of a contingent of mainly government and foundation-funded experts devoted, like him, to showing that war has been declining in importance especially in the more civilized, lighter-skinned parts of the world and is becoming less harmful even to the darker-skinned peoples in the countries under attack. The claims of these individuals and groups are often as preposterous as Rummel's even if they are better at keeping their right-wing biases under wraps. One of Pinker's major government-funded sources is the Human Security Report Project at Simon Fraser University. 173 HSR Peace Report 2009/2010 advanced many of the global themes reiterated in Better Angels, in particular the decline of interstate wars since the end of the Cold War and the development of a new global security architecture. 174 It is revealing that HSRP makes only one mention of NATO in its entire report, as one of the international organizations, have increased the number of their peace operations during the same years. 175. Like Pinker, HSRP lauds the alleged democratic peace that has seen the number of democracies double while the number of dictatorships was cut in half. HSRP admits that the democratic peace thesis has some holes in it, because although democracies no longer fight wars among themselves, they frequently fight non-democracies. 176 Never mind who starts these wars, what real purposes they advance, and whether they are consistent with the UN Charter and international law, their targets are bad guys, non-democracies, rogue states, failed states, terrorist havens, and the like. The 50 NATO member and partner states contributing troops and 66. Materiel to the U.S. war in Afghanistan as of early 2012. 177 were engaged in counter-terrorism, peacemaking, security, and state and democracy building. The fact that troops from this many countries were participating in these alleged missions thus cannot be regarded as counter-evidence for the new peace and the democratic peace, but rather as support for both of them. 178 The Western great powers are good. The development of Islamic political violence is a particular source of disquiet for security planners in the West, the HSPR adds, as in 2008 4 of the 5 most deadly conflicts in the world, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia, pitted Islamic insurgents against national governments and their US and other supporters. 179 Like the democratic peace, which remains peaceful even though the democracies go right on attacking other countries, the Iraqi, Afghan, Pakistani, and Somali theaters remain deadly due to Islamic political violence, not due to the attacks by the United States and its allies. Among Pinker's sources, definitional sleights of hand such as these abound. A 2011 paper by the International Peace Research Institute of Oslo concluded in its comparison of its own work and that carried out by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden that both datasets agree that the severity of war, as measured by the annual battle deaths, has decreased over the past 20 years, and that it seems evident that war is waning. 180 But the strength of these claims is exaggerated greatly by the fact that the UCDP and PRIO focus on direct or battle-related deaths to the exclusion of deaths that can be far more numerous during wartime, but are not directly related to actual battles. 181 Direct deaths conform to our basic intuition of what it means for an agent to be responsible for an effect that it causes, Pinker argues. 67. In defense of this method, namely that the agent foresees the effect, intends for it to happen, and makes it happen via a chain of events that does not have too many uncontrollable intervening variables. He continues. 182. The problem with estimating indirect deaths is that it requires us to undertake the philosophical exercise of stimulating in our imagination the possible world in which the war didn't occur and estimating the number of deaths that took place in that world, which then is used as a baseline. And that requires something close to omniscience. If Saddam Hussein had not been deposed, would he have gone on to kill more political enemies than the number of people who died in the intercommunal violence following his defeat, Estimating indirect deaths requires answering these sorts of questions in a consistent way for hundreds of conflicts, an impossible undertaking. Not only is this a disingenuous argument, and Pinker's counterexample of Iraq outlandish, but Pinker himself doesn't believe it, as he and his sources violate it whenever they deal with communist regimes. For these regimes, attributing indirect, non-combat-related deaths to a deliberate plan requires no imaginative leap at all. The communists are maximally guilty for all of them, and estimating deaths poses no methodological problems. Like Rommel, the HSRP, UCDP, and PRIO minimize U.S. and Western-led war-making and killing. Indeed, so systematic are the UCDP and PRIO labors to this end 183 that they treat the U.S. role in the wars in the Koreas 184 and Vietnam 185 as secondary, that is, as merely providing support to the governments of South Korea and South Vietnam, even though the United States established these governments, and bore overwhelming responsibility for most of the killing and destruction in the wars. In the same date set, the U.S. overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 is treated as an internal armed conflict between the Arbenz government and the forces of Carlos Castillo Armas, with the U.S. role suppressed. 186 The violence generated by the counterinsurgency regimes of Guatemala 187 and El Salvador 188 is once again treated as the result of internal armed conflicts, with no mention of the crucial U.S. role in arming, training, and supporting these regimes. In Nicaragua, the U.S. role first in supporting the Somoza dictatorship against the Sandinistas rebels and later in creating and supporting the Contras and the FDN against the Sandinista government is also suppressed. 189 Many other examples could be added. In contrast, the Soviet role in Hungary 190 and later Afghanistan 191 is treated as primary, with these armed conflicts classified as interstate, that is, as occurring between the Soviet Union and Hungary and Afghanistan, with both initiated by acts of cross-border Soviet aggression. It is on the basis of methodologies as politicized as these that the long peace, the new peace, and the democratic peace have been constructed. Among Pinker and the rest of the waning of war cadre, the imperial role of the United States simply disappears. 69. Massaging the numbers, Pinker's non-proofs of long-term violence reduction. Better Angels contains 115 figures, roughly one for every 6 pages of text. With statistical flourishes on this scale, Pinker creates the impression of an author in command of a powerful numeracy. Indeed, this is one of Better Angels' most successful illusions. But the book's figures frequently fail to teach the lessons that Pinker claims they do, and quite often their lack of substance is disguised by the bravado with which he discusses them. Given limited space, we will zero in on 4 of Pinker's most important figures. The first is figure 222, percentage of deaths in warfare in non-state and state societies, a bar diagram that purports to show the various odds that a person died at the hands of another person rather than passing away of natural causes at different times and places in history. 192. The distinction between state and non-state carries a heavy burden in Better Angels. Against the belief that humans are peaceable by nature and corrupted by modern institutions, 193, and that the world we made has contaminated us, perhaps irretrievably, 194 ideas that he identifies with romantic writers such as Rousseau, 195 Pinker argues that a logic of violence 196 pervades human affairs, and that humans spent almost their entire life on the planet trapped in a violent world. Invoking Hobbes, Pinker agrees that the natural state of men, before they entered into society, was a mere war, and that not simply, but a war of all men, against all men. 197 Hence the symbolic and emotional significance of non-state. 70. And state for Pinker, the first means a ubiquitous war of all against all stretching back into the dark and distant past, the second, humans learning to live more peaceably as they developed agriculture and permanent settlements, and the central authority of states replaced the state of anarchy. 198. In figure 222, Pinker purports to illustrate this grand scheme. He does this by comparing the percentages of violent deaths from 39 graves he identifies with non-state societies, and the percentages in 8 state societies. Needless to say, the reported percentages in the 39 non-state graves, on average, are dramatically higher than in the state societies. Pinker then provides the lesson that he wants us to learn from figure 2-2, the major cleft in the graph, that is, between the higher and lower percentages of deaths caused by violence separates the anarchical bands and tribes from the governed states. Some of Pinker's small number of early critics noted how misleading it is to lump the disparate human groups associated with the first 39 graves into the same non-state category, as even the most complete forensic inquiry into their mortal remains could hardly tell the story of what life and death had been like prior to the advent of civilization. 199. Also revealing is the cavalier attitude that he takes towards his data, and the huge fudge factors he entertains. He offers a 0 to 60% range for the bodies recovered from one subset of 21 non-state graves he labels prehistoric, and claims that this series of estimates that are literally all over the map can be reduced to a meaningful final average of 15%. Similarly, he offers a 14% average for violent deaths among the 8 graves he designates as hunter-gatherers, and a 24.5% average for the 10 hunter-horticulturalists' graves. 71. But were the bodies that Pinker alleges can be associated with violent deaths combat-related deaths, sacrifices, or accidents? Were the artifacts recovered with these bodies evidence of weapons or other kinds of tools? In cases when they are clearly weapons, were they also causes of death or the purely symbolic accoutrements of burial? Indeed, in one careful assessment of Pinker's list of the 21 prehistoric graves, the anthropologist R. Brian Ferguson concludes that this list consists of cherry-picked cases with high casualties, and that in passing off these highly unusual cases as representative of prehistory, Pinker distorts war's antiquity and lethality. 200. Recall that when Pinker deals with the Johns Hopkins research into Iraqi mortality rates under the U.S. war and military occupation, he is quick to dismiss their work because of its alleged Main Street bias. Also that in rejecting the careful work of these researchers, his stated reasons included the complaint that, without meticulous criteria for selecting a sample, extrapolations to an entire population can be wildly off unless, of course, the extrapolation is from 39 graves out of an unknown but vast population base to the claim that humans had been making war forever. Still other fundamental problems afflict Pinker's story. In Better Angels, he argues that the violent potential for which he believes the components of human intelligence and the emotions had been naturally selected over evolutionary time have been softened or pacified by the development of permanent human settlements and the centralized authorities that governed them during the past 10,000 to 12,000 years. The logic of the Leviathan displaced the logic of violence wherever central authorities took hold. But in one of the rare informed reviews of this tried Hobbesian 72. Message, the anthropologist Douglas P. Fry argued that Pinker's history of violence and war is upside down. The archaeological facts speak clearly, Fry noted, showing for particular geographic areas exactly when war began. And in all cases this was recent, not ancient activity occurring after complex forms of social organization supplanted nomadic hunting and gathering. 201 Among the artifices of civilization we must count war. In fact, a whole alternative expert literature rejects Pinker's view on this matter. 202 Warfare is largely a development of the past 10,000 years, R. Brian Ferguson has written. Multiple archaeological indicators of war are absent until the development of a more sedentary existence and or increasing socio-political complexity, usually in combination with some form of ecological crisis and or steep ecological gradients. 203 Other crucial factors falling under the complexity rubric were the earliest manifestations and subsequent development of class structures, divisions of labor and social status, concentrations of wealth and poverty, and hierarchies of power and subordination, including religious and military power structures, all of the sins still very much with us in the modern world. Thus, while a certain logic of violence may be natural to human life at an interpersonal level, there is no evidence that violence and war were central to the development of humans for the first 95% of the past 200,000 years or any time before. In reverse engineering Homo sapiens and projecting war forever backwards, older than the human species, something that our ancestors have been practicing war for at least 6 million years, and turning war into a selective pressure acting on the chimpanzee hominid common ancestors and their descendants, the academic survivalists among pinkers. 73. Sources are playing time machine, transporting humans whose psyches have been distorted by modern civilization back into the past. 204 Pinker's theory that the development and spread of central governments associated with the early cities ushered in the first major historical decline in violence fails its test and fails it spectacularly. The second figure that we want to look at is not indexed among the book's list of figures. However, it appears in a section where Pinker purports to answer the question, was the 20th century really the worst? The enduring moral trend of the century, he writes, was a violence-averse humanism that originated in the Enlightenment, became overshadowed by counter-Enlightenment ideologies wedded to agents of growing destructive power, and regained momentum in the wake of World War II. Proving this point, and proving that the massive death toll, suffering, and destruction associated with the Second World War does not blow holes in his declining violence/better angels narrative, are two of the purposes of the longest chapter in his book, The Long Peace. Pinker calls this figure the 20 worst things people have done to each other. Adapted from the work of the atrocitologist Matthew White, the table lists 21 hemoclysms, attributes each one to a cause, provides an estimated death toll for each one, and adjusts these estimates from the world's population at the time of each hemoclysm. Up to their mid-20th century equivalent, the world's population as of 1950, when it stood at roughly 2.5 billion people. 74. Perhaps the most striking feature of this figure is that whereas in his own book, White ranks the Second World War in the number 1 spot with 66 million deaths, calls it the most destructive man-made event in history, 206, and rejects the method of adjusting death tolls to reflect a constant world population. Under Pinker's adjusted rankings, the Second World War ranks no higher than 9th place overall, less lethal than the Inlushan Revolt, the Mongol conquests, the Mideast slave trade, the fall of the Ming dynasty, the fall of Rome, the reign of Timur-Lenk, the annihilation of the American Indians, and the Atlantic slave trade. Pinker insists that adjusted rankings are needed to correct for two illusions. The first is that while the 20th century certainly had more violent deaths than earlier ones, it also had more people. The other is what he calls historical myopia. The further in the past an era is from our own, the fewer details we know about it. Taking the Inlushan Revolt, Pinker claims that it would have cost the lives of 429 million people, adjusted from the world's population around 750 AD to 1950. As Pinker credits World War II with an unadjusted 55 million deaths, this means that by his reckoning, World War II was only 1/8 as lethal as the Inlushan Revolt. 207 Hence our technologically more advanced modern era has not been the most violent after all. Our thinking is rife with illusions. But once again serious problems abound with Pinker's reasoning and data. In what sense are his earlier destructive events genuinely and consistently events? Whereas World War II is relatively easy for us to define, 4 of Pinker's higher-ranking hemoclysms span multiple centuries: the Mideast slave trade, the fall of Rome, the annihilation of the American Indians, and the Atlantic slave trade. If this is 75. How he wants us to think about violence, then we should also enumerate the structural violence of the kind that Sen and Dries analyze, and that takes into account the human losses which follow from the policy actions and inactions of the global capitalist structures, but which Pinker passes over because it falls outside his conception of violence. Given that many more people are alive today, and that our scientific and technological capacities would enable us to remedy much of the avoidable suffering and loss that remains with us, were our political capacities equally as developed, Surely our modern world is awash in unacknowledged hemoclisms. 208. Also important is the fact that the estimated death tolls in well over half of the cases Pinker lists in this figure are extremely uncertain, but he can live with them. It is only the higher-end mortality estimates for Iraq and the Democratic Republic of Congo in our day that he feels compelled to challenge on technical grounds of exactitude. Perhaps most important, the absolute numbers of people who die because of armed conflicts are a first-order measure of the true human cost of violence, and we should never permit the moral gravity of this loss and suffering to be relativized by the juggling of numbers until they all match the same global population in any given year. 209. After all, what relationship did the mass deaths in the China of the 750s and 760s AD have with the human population then spread across the rest of the earth, whatever its size? Similarly, what relevance did the large population of Asia in the first half of the 20th century have to the fact that the machinery of death available at the time of the Second World War set new records in mass violence? 76. With the most civilized countries leading the killing process? Should the Nazi Holocaust be downgraded in importance because the populations of China and India were so large? Pinker's population adjustments enable him to achieve two ends: to inflate death tolls from the past and to minimize those in the modern period. But he is not suffering from some kind of reverse historical myopia or expanding denominator illusion. Rather, he is massaging the numbers. As another one of the rare critical reviews of Pinker's book to have appeared in an establishment source put the matter, Pinker plays down the technical ability of modern societies to support greater numbers of human lives. If carrying capacity increases faster than mass murder, this looks like moral improvement on the charts, but it might mean only that fertilizers and antibiotics are outpacing machine guns and machetes for now. 210. And nuclear weapons. This brings us to the third figure that we want to examine, figure 5-3, 100 Worst Wars and Atrocities of Human History. 77. In his treatment of the scatter plot of 100 data points, Pinker's discussion is perhaps the most dishonest in his book. Based on Matthew White's list of the 100 events with the largest man-made death tolls, 211, and arranged in chronological order from the earliest to the most recent, Pinker introduces one crucial change in White's numbers. Pinker adjusts each reported death toll to its percentage of the world's population around the time the event occurred. As we saw above, the effect of this kind of adjustment is decisive. It makes smaller death tolls appear much larger when the world's population was much smaller, and it makes larger death tolls appear much smaller when the world's population was much larger. To express the same criticism in a different way, the further away from the year 2000 an event is plotted, the greater its death toll will appear, and the closer to the year 2000 an event is plotted, the smaller will be its apparent death toll. 78. Thus figure 5-3 plots 10 events that in Pinker's adjusted rankings turn out to be more lethal than the First and Second World Wars. Circled dots represent events with death rates higher than the 20th century world wars. Pinker explains, from left to right, these are associated with the Xian dynasty, the Three Kingdoms of China, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Inlushan Revolt, the reign of Genghis Khan, the Mideast slave trade, the reign of Timur Lenk, the Atlantic slave trade, the fall of the Ming dynasty, and the conquest of the Americas. 212. Because the data are plotted on a base 10 logarithmic scale, what numerical values the data points represent on the vertical axis are impossible to determine. Nevertheless, figure 5-3 conveys visually and with an air of statistical certitude the two main points that Pinker wants to drive home about the 20th century, that it wasn't the most violent overall, and that World War II wasn't the most destructive man-made event in history. But this is methodology with a political rather than scientific purpose. Pinker adopts it not because it helps him to illuminate atrocities throughout human history, but because it enables him to reduce the apparent scale of atrocities in the recent past. In his discussion of figure 5-3, Pinker writes that the cloud of data tapers rightward and downward into smaller and smaller conflicts for years that are closer to the present, and he asks, how can we explain this funnel? But in asking this question, Pinker is admitting that figure 5-3 shows that a greater number of hemoclisms have occurred in the recent past than in the distant past, with their frequency accelerating. 79. Over the past 100 to 200 years. Simply looking at what Pinker calls the funnel, in the lower right-hand corner, below the 100 deaths per 100,000 line, we can see that roughly 1/2 of this graph's total of 100 data points are plotted there. This means that figure 5-3 shows the opposite of what Pinker contends it does. The frequency and absolute levels of violence have been increasing into the modern era, as more and more data points cluster there. This is what explains the funnel. And poor Pinker cannot explain what went wrong. So once again he resorts to our alleged historical myopia. He quotes the speculation of Matthew White: maybe the only reason it appears that so many were killed in the past 200 years is because we have more records from that period. And he adds to this his own speculation, as well as that of the political scientist James Paine. Of course, for every massacre that was recorded by some chronicler and then overlooked or dismissed, there must have been many others that were never chronicled in the first place. As James Paine has noted, any study that claims to show an increase in wars over time without correcting for historical myopia only shows that the Associated Press is a more comprehensive source of information about battles around the world than were 16th century monks. 213. But this, too, is methodology with a political purpose, and with it, Pinker has done no better than resort to a Donald Rumsfeld class excuse for the missing weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In fact, in his treatment of figure 5-3's failure to show what he claims that it shows, Pinker outdoes even. 80. Rumsfeld: the absence of evidence counts as veritable proof. As you go back into the past, he pleads, historical coverage hurdles exponentially downward for 2.5 centuries, then falls with a gentler but still exponential decline for the 3 millennia before. If more conflicts fell beneath the military horizon in the anarchic feudal societies, frontiers, and tribal lands of the early periods than in the clashes between leviathans of the later ones, then the earlier periods would appear less violent to us than they really were. For Pinker, war simply must have been more frequent and more lethal in the distant past than in the modern era. When the 100 data points of his own graph not only fail to show this, but show the opposite, they must be explained away as the result of historical myopia, and Pinker dismisses figure 5-3 even as he hangs onto it. In the words of the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, Pinker's excuses are not even wrong. The last figure that we want to examine is figure 5-6, Richardson's data, which alludes to the work of the 20th century mathematician, meteorologist, and pacifist Lewis Fry Richardson. Pinker is quite fond of Richardson, whose posthumously published and ponderous Statistics of Deadly Quarrels 214 is featured prominently in Better Angels. Pinker devotes 2 dense sections to Richardson's work, one on the timing of wars and the other on the magnitude of wars. Figure 5-6 depicts the 315 wars that Richardson identified as having either ended or started sometime between 1820 and 1950. 215. 81. On the page in Pinker's book where figure 5-6 appears, many of the 315 lines of data are a blur to the eye, just as they are here. But as the lessons that Pinker strains to impose on these data are even blurrier, let Pinker explain them. The segments in figure 5-6 represent events of various durations, and they are arranged from left to right in time and from bottom to top in magnitude. Richardson showed that the events are governed by a Poisson process, they stop and start at random. Your eye may discern some patterns, for example, a scarcity of segments at the top left, and the 2 floaters at the top right. But by now you have learned to distrust these apparitions. And indeed Richardson showed that there was no statistically significant trend in the distribution of magnitudes from the beginning. 82. Of the sequence to the end. Cover up the 2 outliers with your thumb, and the impression of randomness is total. These are remarkably deceptive claims, and no amount of hocus pocus can save them. Recall that in his discussion of figure 5-3, Pinker acknowledges but then dismisses the dramatic increase in data points marking armed conflicts in the recent past, and he speculates about the occurrence of conflicts in the distant past for which he has no evidence. So it is with figure 5 to 6, he acknowledges that the two most lethal conflicts in the past several hundred years were the First and Second World Wars, but he dismisses this fact by labeling them floaters and apparitions, dazzles his readers with Poisson processes, 216 cognitive illusions, and power law distributions, 217, and urges us to cover up the two outliers with thumbs. Voila! They disappear. Both world wars were statistical illusions. Throughout, Pinker contends that the alleged randomness of events such as the Second World War renders both its timing and its magnitude irrelevant to our understanding of it. He pretends that figure 5 to 3 and figure 5 to 6 show what they manifestly do not show, and that they don't show what they really do. He asks us to believe that as the randomness of World War I and World War II is total, and the fact that they occurred in modern times teaches us nothing about the modern world. And he ignores his own contention that since our better angels are gradually triumphing over 83 our inner demons, and that modern institutions are the major exogenous cause of this victory, then our better angels should be skewing this data over time towards fewer and smaller wars, rather than leaving random results. What is more, in writing about the drivers of war, those psychological or game-theoretic dynamics that govern whether quarreling coalitions will threaten, back down, bluff, engage, escalate, fight on, or surrender apply whether the coalitions are street gangs, militias, or armies of great powers. Pinker concludes that size doesn't matter. He offers a number of eccentric comparisons between war and forest fires and landslides, game theory, 218 Weber's law, and the Pareto principle, all in the hope of persuading his readers that, to repeat his point again, war involves a set of underlying processes in which size doesn't matter. And he adds that war escapes our desire for a coherent historical narrative, our tendency to see meaningful clusters in randomly spaced events, and the bell curve mindset that makes extreme values seem astronomically unlikely. So when we come across an extreme event, we reason that there must have been extraordinary design behind it. The two world wars were, in a sense, horrifically unlucky samples from a statistical distribution that stretches across a vast range of destruction. Pinker wants us to believe that the relative power of war makers and the institutional forces developing within and between them don't matter. After all, was it not the emergence and consolidation of leviathans that made it possible for our better angels to assert themselves and peaceableness to grow? Manchuria was just as likely to invade Japan in 1931 as was Japan to invade Manchuria, Poland just as likely to 84. Invade Germany in 1939 as Germany to invade Poland, and Iraq just as likely to invade the United States in 2003 as the United States to invade Iraq. He also wants us to believe that the existence of a military-industrial complex, rooted in the richest and most powerful country to emerge from the ruins of the Second World War, is irrelevant to the probability that it will engage in wars, and to the deadliness of the wars in which it does. Suppose, Pinker writes, for the sake of argument, that World War II was the most destructive event in history. What does that tell us about long-term trends in war and peace? The answer is, nothing. The most destructive event in history had to take place in some century, and it could be embedded in any of a large number of very different long-term trends. With comments such as these, Pinker is imploring us to ignore major pieces of evidence that violence has reached new and more lethal heights in modern times. This is the final triumph of ideology. Concluding note. Taven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined is a terrible book, both as a technical work of scholarship and as a moral tract and guide, but it is extremely well attuned to the demands of US and Western elites at the start of the 21st century, with its optimistic message that the better angels of their nature are taking charge, and its lament over the other peoples of the world, whose inner demons and cultural backwardness have prevented them from keeping up. 85. With his country engaged in a record-breaking number of simultaneous wars and interventions on 4 continents, with NATO expanding and asserting its military dominance globally, with Israeli settlement and dispossession policies unabated on the West Bank, with the United States and Israel threatening to attack Iran, and with some critics expressing profound concern over a deteriorating institutional environment in which it has become hard to imagine any president or Congress standing up to the powerful vested interests of the Pentagon, the secret intelligence agencies and the military-industrial complex. 220 Along comes Pinker bearing his 832-page gift on the declining relevance of war. Pinker's book also coincides with the surprising emergence of an Occupy movement that is protesting a wide range of political, economic, and social developments that have increased human insecurity, inequality, and unemployment, filled U.S. prisons, and diminished the democratic substance of elections and political power. This is also a period in which civil liberties have been under serious attack, the right to habeas corpus suspended, torture openly employed and given legal sanction by the executive branch, and free speech rights of protest subject to increasing restriction. The convenience of Pinker's themes and the warm reception of his work reminds us of the similar treatment of Claire Sterling's book The Terror Network back in 1981, 221, when her stress on an alleged Soviet responsibility for cross-border terrorism fit so well the Reagan administration's intensified focus on terrorism and the threats posed by the evil empire. Sterling's work was ludicrously sourced and biased, and easily shown to be 86. Intellectually indefensible, 222 But the Terror Network was given great attention and treated with respect in the media, and excerpts from it were published in establishment journals and presented as credible and authoritative. 223. It is true that Pinker's book employs a much larger scholarly apparatus, but this is a misleading facade. He relies heavily on the work of the International Peace Research Institute of Oslo as well as the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, 2 organizations whose findings largely overlap and, as we have seen, categorize the overwhelming U.S. role in the Afghan and Iraqi theaters of violence over the last decade as secondary to internal and intercommunal warfare. 224 Pinker also relies on the Vancouver-based Human Security Report Project, whose work draws heavily from that of PRIO and UCDP, and whose interrelated themes of a decline in great power violence and the shrinking costs of war, reversed in recent years by a surge in Islamist political violence, 225, fit well the foreign and domestic policies of the Western imperial powers. Pinker relies also on the work of Matthew White, who in his own book on the worst atrocities in history asserts that the Western philosophy of war-making tries to avoid killing civilians. Under this philosophy, White explains, the 1945 atomic bombing of Hiroshima is justified as a legitimate act of war, while the 1983 suicide bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut is condemned as terrorism. The key difference, White adds, was that one was performed openly against a declared enemy who had the opportunity to fight back or surrender, while the other was sneaky. 226 That is, not an act of resistance to occupying armies that had just killed some 20,000 people and were still indiscriminately shelling the hills around Beirut. Pinker also relies on Rudolf Rummel's work, a man who believes that Barack Obama is a left-wing appeaser. 87. Of global tyrants, and busily engineering a coup d'état in the United States. 227 Rummel's twin volumes on democide are so badly deformed by bias that he estimated that all but 5,500 Vietnamese civilians killed by U.S. forces during the war were collateral damage and thus the unintended victims of a civilian protective war policy, whereas North Vietnam had deliberately targeted and killed vastly greater numbers, all as a matter of policy. 228 Pinker himself claims that at least 800,000 civilians died in Vietnam, but he also adds that these were battle deaths, 229, and that the deaths ultimately were a result of the Vietnamese Communists' fanatical dedication to outlasting their opponents, that is, to their refusal to submit to superior force. Better Angels has been received even more warmly than was Claire Sterling's book, garnering many positive reviews, and its author invited to lecture about it and to appear on numerous radio, television, and podcast interviews. 230 The New York Times treated the book to at least 5 prominent mentions prior to the flattering front-page account it received in the Sunday Book Review in early October 2011 by philosopher Peter Singer, in which Singer called it supremely important and a masterly achievement. 231 Overall, the Times reviewed, excerpted, discussed, blogged, mentioned, or invited Pinker himself to reiterate its themes in more than 20 different items. 232 That was quite a positive push by the United States' most prominent newspaper. Even more noteworthy is the fact that so many liberals and leftists have been taken in by better angels. The British philosopher Simon Blackburn praised the riveting and myth-destroying book, with its positive history of humanity and its wealth of historical, anthropological, and geographical data. 233 The British political scientist David Runciman called 88. It a brilliant, mind-altering book, and swallowed Pinker's careful, compelling account of why the 20th century does not invalidate his thesis that violence is in a long decline because the violence of the 20th century is best understood as a series of random spasms, according to Runciman, and because the 2 world wars were essentially freak events, driven by contingency and in some cases lunacy. 234 Both reviewers display the same inability or unwillingness to engage in serious institutional analysis as does Pinker. In this country, Stephen Colbert had Pinker as a guest on his popular Comedy Central program, but asked him no serious questions. Pinker himself repeated without challenge his mantra that we may be living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. 235 Colbert did, however, find the courage to add that Stalin killed 20 million people. Mao killed 70 million people. Hitler racked up 6 million Jews alone and then like a cluster of millions of everybody else he didn't care for. David Sirota also interviewed Pinker on his Colorado-based radio show. Sirota's webpage at the KKZN radio station announces that Pinker's book is startling and engaging, and adds in what appears to have been reproduced from the promotional literature of the Pinker camp that Pinker shows, we may be living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence. 236. In introducing Pinker on his MSNBC show, The Nation's Chris Hayes called Better Angels a phenomenal book, and added later that the book is very persuasive that things are getting better, that humans are actually getting less violent. Hayes asked no challenging questions about this book during his 2-hour show. And in the show's closing You Should Know segment, Pinker said that the audience should know that the 89 rate of death in war has been going down since 1946, to which Hayes added that, yes, all of us should know that it's getting better, even in really bad weeks it's getting better. 237. But do Colbert, Sirota, and Hayes really go along with Pinker's view that the 1960s was a decade of decivilization, and that the mushrooming of the U.S. prison population over the past 35 years is a sign of progress, as it further thinned the ranks of the uncivilized roaming the streets? Do they accept that what those overly indulgent and future-discounting savages had suffered from was a lack of self-control, rather than adverse social conditions? And that the recivilizing process from the 1990s on, which included intensive policing, mass incarceration, and the reduction of welfare state pampering was the key to this improvement? Do they also accept Pinker's accolades to Charles Murray, Richard Herrenstein, James Q. Wilson, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan for emphasizing the alleged socio-biological roots of the class structure and inequality of U.S. society, and go along with his denunciations of the hard left deniers of human nature whom, 238 in contrast to Pinker and his allies, have radical political agendas and want to protect the welfare state's undermining of self-control and reversal of the civilizing process? Are they not aware that Pinker completely ignores the structural violence of the global class war that has increased inequality and interacted with systems of state violence to enlarge internal security operations and prison populations? That many of the Western so-called democracies are really national security states? And that Pinker classifies these as the advanced guard of the civilizing process? Do they accept that the post-World War II era was a long peace, and for Pinker's reason that the great powers fought 90. No wars among themselves? Do they buy into Pinker's view that the role of the United States in this era was merely the containment of an expansionist communist enemy, and had no self-interested purpose or ideological base? Do they agree with his shifting of responsibility for Korean and Vietnamese civilian deaths in those distant wars from the United States to the communist sides? What do they think about Pinker's citing the peace movements of the 1960s and during the run-up to the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq as evidence of the growth of our better angels, while failing to explain why those angels neither prevented nor stopped the wars? Could it be that institutional factors, the global interests of transnational corporations and the military-industrial complex, the refusal of the nuclear weapons states to give up their advantage, a permanent war system that is more resource-commanding than ever, and possesses the potential for unprecedented destruction, carry more weight in policy decisions than does the socio-biological expansion in the powers of reason and empathy speculatively asserted by Pinker, but impossible to prove? Can they not see the inversion of reality in the notion that it is a militant Islam that is the cause of Western intervention in Islamic countries? And that the Islamic threat that Pinker elevates to ominous levels is contrived and, like Soviet containment, an excuse for a violent and forward-looking policy, necessary to meet Western institutional demands? This critical failure to understand Pinker's misrepresentations no doubt rests in part on the sheer volume of the purported evidence that he throws at his readers, with more than 1,950 endnotes, some 1,100 references, and roughly one figure for every 6 pages of text. But selectivity and ideological bias dominate throughout. 91. And his key evidence does not withstand close scrutiny. We have shown that Pinker's most basic idea, that humans moved from a Hobbesian condition of chronic warfare via the growth of civilization and the Leviathan state to a slowly and unevenly developing peaceableness, is not sustained by credible evidence. In fact, the extant archaeological record flatly contradicts it, and in his review of Better Angels, the anthropologist Douglas P. Fry referred to this as Pinker's big lie. 239. But without the counter-myth of the violent savage, there could be no pacification process, and his story about the better angels of our nature would take on an entirely different cast than the one he gives us, in which human history contains an arrow and violence meanders downward. Pinker calls the belief that the 20th century was the bloodiest in history a cliché and an illusion. He deals with the fact that World War II was the historical peak in war-related deaths, and World War I a big-time killer as well, by several tricks. One is to relativize deaths by adjusting the numbers killed in earlier conflicts to later and much larger population bases, so that although the absolute death toll from World War II tops all others, he can depict it as far less deadly than several other wars and conflagrations from centuries long ago. But while Pinker makes violence into a relative matter in order to prove his main theme, he often mentions the long historical diminution in violence without making explicit that he is talking about relative, not absolute, levels of violence. But increases in absolute levels of violence might well be independent of the sizes of the population base. Surely the U.S. attacks on Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq were rooted in independent factors, not the number of people then living on the planet. Nor was there any link between the Nazi 92. Holocaust and the population of China. Another Pinker device is to claim that the great wars of the 20th century were random events, and in his books many figures where he cannot avoid the deadliness of the First and Second World Wars, he waves off their magnitude as statistical illusions. They are outliers and even apparitions, and he urges us to forget that they both occurred in the past 100 years. They are unrelated to modernity, whose forces for the reduction of violence remain sacrosanct in spite of these and subsequent wars and the evident failure of the better angels to do their work. Yet another trick is to start the long peace conveniently at the end of World War II, and to define it as a period in which there have been no wars between the great powers. But the First and especially the Second World War had taught them that with their advancing and life-threatening means of self-destruction, they could not go on playing their favorite game of mutual slaughter any longer. But this didn't prevent them from carrying out numerous and deadly wars against the Third World, which filled in the great power war gap nicely. Thus the long peace a brief 67 years through 2012 has been peaceful only in a Pinkerton sense, and it appears to have very shallow or even no roots in our better angels. Furthermore, as we have stressed, it is increasingly threatened by a Western elite-instigated global class war and a permanent war system fueled by threats manufactured by institutional structures that continue to overwhelm these better angels. In the final analysis, the better angels of our nature is an inflated political tract that misuses data and rewrites history in accord with its author's clear ideological biases, while finding ideology at work only in the actions of his opponents. 93. Pinker fears that readers will find his book wiggish and presentist and historically naive, but this secular theodicy is animated by the spirit of Dr. Pangloss more than anyone else. 240 And with its deep commitments to an elitist, Western imperial point of view, it transcends even Voltaire's character in the fantasy that everything done by the Holy State and its minions is leading to the best of all actual worlds. Small wonder, then, that the message of better angels pleases so well the editors of the New York Times and the large U.S. permanent war establishment. It is regrettable that despite its manifest problems, the book has bamboozled so many other people who should know better. 94.